Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault by Stephen Hicks, read by the author. First edition of Explaining Postmodernism was published in 2004 by Scholargy Publishing. The expanded edition was published in 2011 by Occam's Razor Publishing. Explaining Postmodernism, Chapter 1. What Postmodernism is. By most accounts, we have entered a new intellectual age. We are postmodern now. Leading intellectuals tell us that modernism has died and that a revolutionary era is upon us, an era liberated from the oppressive strictures of the past, but at the same time disquieted by its expectations for the future. Even postmodernism's opponents, surveying the intellectual scene and not liking what they see, acknowledge a new cutting edge. In the intellectual world, there has been a changing of the guard. The names of the postmodern vanguard are now familiar. Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, and Richard Rorty. They are its leading strategists. They set the direction of the movement and provide it with its most potent tools. The vanguard is aided by other familiar and often infamous names. Stanley Fish and Frank Lantricchia in literary and legal criticism, Catherine MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin in feminist legal criticism, Jacques Lacan in psychology, Robert Venturi and Andreas Huyssen in architectural criticism, and Luce Irigaray in the criticism of science. Members of this elite group set the direction and tone for the postmodern intellectual world. Michel Foucault has identified the major targets. Quote, "All my analyses are against the idea of universal necessities in human existence." Unquote. Such necessities must be swept aside as baggage from the past. Quote, "It is meaningless to speak in the name of or against reason, truth, or knowledge." Unquote. Richard Rorty has elaborated on that theme, explaining that that is not to say that postmodernism is true or that it offers knowledge. Such assertions would be self-contradictory. So postmodernists must use language ironically. Quote, "The difficulty faced by a philosopher who, like myself, is sympathetic to this suggestion, for example Foucault's, one who thinks of himself as auxiliary to the poet rather than to the physicist, is to avoid hinting that this suggestion gets something right, that my sort of philosophy corresponds to the way things really are. For this talk of correspondence brings back just the idea that my sort of philosopher wants to get rid of, the idea that the world or the self has an intrinsic nature." Unquote. If there is no world or self to understand and get right on their own terms, then what is the purpose of thought or action? Having deconstructed reason, truth, and the idea of the correspondence of thought to reality, and then set them aside, quote, "Reason," writes Foucault, "is the ultimate language of madness." Unquote. There is nothing to guide or constrain our thoughts and feelings, so we can do or say whatever we feel like. Deconstruction, Stanley Fish confesses happily, quote, "relieves me of the obligation to be right and demands only that I be interesting." Unquote. Many postmodernists, though, are less often in the mood for aesthetic play than for political activism. Many deconstruct reason, truth, and reality because they believe that in the name of reason, truth, and reality, Western civilization has wrought dominance, oppression, and destruction. Quote, "Reason and power are one and the same," Jean-François Lyotard states. "Both lead to and are synonymous with prisons, prohibitions, selection process, the public good." Unquote. Postmodernism then becomes an activist strategy against the coalition of reason and power. Postmodernism, Frank Lantricchia explains, quote, "seeks not to find the foundation and the conditions of truth, but to exercise power for the purpose of social change." Unquote. The task of postmodern professors is to help students, quote, "spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time." Unquote. Those horrors, according to postmodernism, are most prominent in the West, Western civilization being where reason and power have been the most developed. But the pain of those horrors is neither inflicted nor suffered equally. Males, whites, and the rich have their hands on the whip of power, and they use it cruelly at the expense of women, racial minorities, and the poor. The conflict between men and women is brutal. Quote, "The normal fuck," writes Andrea Dworkin, "by a normal man is taken to be an act of invasion and ownership undertaken in a mode of predation." Unquote. This special insight into the sexual psychology of males is matched and confirmed by the sexual experience of women. Quote, "Women have been chattels to men as wives, as prostitutes, as sexual and reproductive servants. Being owned and being fucked are or have been virtually synonymous experiences in the lives of women. He owns you. He fucks you. The fucking conveys the quality of ownership. He owns you inside out." Unquote. Dworkin and her colleague, Catherine McKinnon, then call for the censorship of pornography on postmodern grounds. Our social reality is constructed by the language we use, and pornography is a form of language, one that constructs a violent and domineering reality for women to submit to. Pornography, therefore, is not free speech, but political oppression. The violence is also experienced by the poor at the hands of the rich, and by the struggling nations at the hands of the capitalist nations. For a striking example, Lyotard asks us to consider the American attack on Iraq in the 1990s. Despite American propaganda, Lyotard writes, "The fact is that Saddam Hussein is a victim and a spokesman for victims of American imperialism the world over." Quote, "Saddam Hussein is a product of Western departments of state and big companies, just as Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco were born of the peace imposed on their countries by the victors of the Great War. Saddam is such a product in even more flagrant and cynical a way. But the Iraqi dictatorship proceeds, as do the others, from the transfer of aporias, that is, insoluble problems, in the capitalist system to vanquished, less developed, or simply less resistant countries." Unquote. Yet the oppressed status of women, the poor, racial minorities, and others is almost always veiled in the capitalist nations. Rhetoric about trying to put the sins of the past behind us, about progress and democracy, about freedom and equality before the law, all such self-serving rhetoric serves only to mask the brutality of capitalist civilization. Rarely do we catch an honest glimpse of its underlying essence. For that glimpse, Foucault tells us we should look to prison. Quote, "Prison is the only place where power is manifested in its naked state, in its most excessive form, and where it is justified as moral force. What is fascinating about prisons is that, for once, power doesn't hide or mask itself. It reveals itself as tyranny pursued into the tiniest details. It is cynical and at the same time pure and entirely, quote, justified, unquote, because its practice can be totally formulated within the framework of morality. Its brutal tyranny consequently appears as the serene domination of good over evil, of order over disorder," unquote. Finally, for the inspirational and philosophical source of postmodernism, for that which connects abstract and technical issues in linguistics and epistemology to political activism, Jacques Derrida identifies the philosophy of Marxism. Quote, "Deconstruction never had meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, than as a radicalization, that is to say, also within the tradition of a certain Marxism, in a certain spirit of Marxism." Unquote. Modern and postmodern. Any intellectual movement is defined by its fundamental philosophical premises. Those premises state what it takes to be real, what it is to be human, what is valuable, and how knowledge is to be acquired. That is, any intellectual movement has a metaphysics, a conception of human nature and values, and an epistemology. Postmodernism often bills itself as anti-philosophical, by which it means that it rejects many traditional philosophical alternatives. Yet any statement or activity including the action of writing a postmodern account of anything, presupposes at least an implicit conception of reality and values. And so, despite its official distaste for some versions of the abstract, the universal, the fixed, and the precise, postmodernism offers a consistent framework of premises within which to situate our thoughts and actions. Abstracting from the above quotations yields the following. Metaphysically, postmodernism is anti-realist, holding that it is impossible to speak meaningfully about an independently existing reality. Postmodernism substitutes instead a social-linguistic constructionist account of reality. Epistemologically, having rejected the notion of an independently existing reality, postmodernism denies that reason or any other method is a means of acquiring objective knowledge of that reality. Having substituted social linguistic constructs for that reality, postmodernism emphasizes the subjectivity, conventionality, and incommensurability of those constructions. Postmodernist accounts of human nature are consistently collectivist, holding that individuals' identities are largely constructed by the social linguistic groups that they are a part of, those groups varying radically across the dimensions of sex, race, ethnicity, and wealth. Postmodern accounts of human nature also consistently emphasize relations of conflict between those groups. And having de-emphasized or eliminated the role of reason, postmodernist accounts hold that those conflicts are resolved primarily by the use of force, whether masked or naked. The use of force in turn leads to relations of dominance, submission, and oppression. Finally, postmodern themes in ethics and politics are characterized by an identification with and sympathy for the groups perceived to be oppressed in the conflicts, and a willingness to enter the fray on their behalf. The term postmodern situates the movement historically and philosophically against modernism. Thus, understanding what the movement sees itself as rejecting and moving beyond will be helpful in formulating a definition of postmodernism. The modern world has existed for several centuries, and after several centuries, we have a good sense of what modernism is. Modernism and the Enlightenment. In philosophy, modernism's essentials are located in the formative figures of Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, and René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, for their influence upon epistemology, and more comprehensively in John Locke, 1632 to 1704, for his influence upon all aspects of philosophy. Bacon, Descartes, and Locke are modern because of their philosophical naturalism, their profound confidence in reason, and especially in the case of Locke, their individualism. Modern thinkers start from nature instead of starting with some form of the supernatural, which had been the characteristic starting point of pre-modern medieval philosophy. Modern thinkers stress that perception and reason are the human means of knowing nature, in contrast to the pre-modern reliance upon tradition, faith, and mysticism. Modern thinkers stress human autonomy and the human capacity for forming one's own character, in contrast to the pre-modern emphasis upon dependence and original sin. Modern thinkers emphasize the individual, seeing the individual as the unit of reality, holding that the individual's mind is sovereign, and that the individual is the unit of value, in contrast to the pre-modern, feudal subordination of the individual to higher political, social, or religious realities and authorities. Modern philosophy came to maturity in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment philosophes quite rightly saw themselves as radical. The pre-modern medieval worldview and the modern Enlightenment worldview were coherent, comprehensive, and entirely opposed accounts of reality and the place of human beings within it. Medievalism had dominated the West for 1,000 years, from roughly 400 CE to 1400 CE. In a centuries-long transition period, the thinkers of the Renaissance, with some unintended help from the major Reformation figures, undermined the medieval worldview and paved the way for the revolutionaries of the 17th and 18th centuries. By the 18th century, the pre-modern philosophy of the medieval era had been routed intellectually, and the philosophers were moving quickly to transform society on the basis of the new modern philosophy. The modern philosophers disagreed among themselves about many issues. but their core agreements outweighed the disagreements. Descartes' account of reason, for example, is rationalist, while Bacon's and Locke's are empiricist, thus placing them at the heads of competing schools. But what is fundamental to all three is the central status of reason as objective and competent, in contrast to the faith, mysticism, and intellectual authoritarianism of earlier ages. Once reason is given pride of place, the entire Enlightenment project follows. If one emphasizes that reason is a faculty of the individual, then individualism becomes a key theme in ethics. Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration, 1689, and Two Treatises of Government, 1690, are landmark texts in the modern history of individualism. Both link the human capacity for reason to ethical individualism and its social consequences, the prohibition of force against another's independent judgment or action, individual rights, political equality, limiting the power of government, and religious toleration. If one emphasizes that reason is the faculty of understanding nature, then that epistemology systematically applied yields science. Enlightenment thinkers laid the foundations of all the major branches of science. In mathematics, Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz independently developed the calculus, Newton developing his version in 1666 and Leibniz publishing his in 1675. The most monumental publication in the history of modern physics, Newton's Principia Mathematica, appeared in 1687. A century of unprecedented investigation and achievement led to the production of Carolus Linnaeus's Systema Naturae in 1735 and Philosophia Botanica in 1751, jointly presenting a comprehensive biological taxonomy, and to the production of Antoine Lavoisier's Traité élémentaire de chimie, Treatise on Chemical Elements, in 1789, the landmark text in the foundations of chemistry. Individualism and science are thus consequences of an epistemology of reason. Both applied systematically have enormous consequences. Individualism applied to politics yields liberal democracy. Liberalism is the principle of individual freedom, and democracy is the principle of decentralizing political power to individualism. As individualism rose in the modern world, feudalism declined. England's liberal revolution in 1688 began the trend. Modern political principles spread to America and France in the 18th century, leading to liberal revolutions there in 1776 and 1789. The weakening and overthrow of the feudal regimes then made possible the extension, practically, of liberal individualist ideas to all human beings. Racism and sexism are obvious affronts to individualism, and so had been increasingly on the defensive as the 18th century progressed. For the first time ever in history, societies were formed for the elimination of slavery. In America in 1784, in England in 1787, and a year later in France. And in 1791 and 1792, the publication of Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Women and Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, landmarks in the push for women's liberty and equality. Individualism applied to economics yields free markets and capitalism. Capitalist economics is based on the principle that individuals should be left free to make their own decisions about production, consumption, and trade. As individualism rose in the 18th century, feudal and mercantilist arguments and institutions declined. With the development of free markets came a theoretical grasp of the productive impact of the division of labor and specialization, and of the retarding impact of protectionism and other restrictive regulations. Capturing and extending those insights, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, is the landmark text in the history of modern economics. Theory and practice developed in tandem, and as markets became freer and more international, the amount of wealth available increased dramatically. For example, NFR Craft's estimates of British average annual income, accepted by both pro- and anti-capitalist historians, show a historically unprecedented rise from $333 in 1700 to $399 in 1760 to $427 in 1800 to $498 in 1830, and then a big jump to $804 in 1860. Science, applied systematically to material production, yields engineering and technology. The new culture of reasoning, experimenting, entrepreneurship, and the free exchange of ideas and wealth meant that by the mid-1700s, scientists and engineers were discovering knowledge and creating technologies on a historically unprecedented scale. The outstanding consequence of this was the Industrial Revolution, which was metaphorically picking up steam by the 1750s and literally picking up steam with the success of James Watt's engine after 1769. Thomas Arkwright's water frame, 1769. James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, around 1769. And Samuel Crompton's mule, 1779. All revolutionized spinning and weaving. Between 1760 and 1780, for example, British consumption of raw cotton went up 540%, from 1.2 to 6.5 million pounds. The rich stuck to their handmade goods for a while, so the first things to be mass-produced in the new factories were cheap goods for the masses. Soap, cotton clothes and linens, shoes, Wedgwood china, iron pots, and so on. Science applied to the understanding of human beings yields medicine. The new approaches to understanding the human being as a naturalistic organism drew upon the new studies, begun in the Renaissance, of human physiology and anatomy. Supernaturalistic and other pre-modern accounts of human ailments were swept aside as, by the second half of the 18th century, medicine put itself increasingly on a scientific footing. The outstanding consequence was that, combined with the rise in wealth, modern medicine increased human longevity dramatically. Edward Jenner's discovery of the smallpox vaccine in 1796, for example, both provided a protection against a major killer of the 18th century and established the science of immunization. Advances in obstetrics both established it as a separate branch of medicine and, more strikingly, contributed to the significant decline of infant mortality rates. In London, for example, the death rate for children before the age of 5 fell from 74.5% in 1730 to 1749 to 31.8% in 1810 to 1829. Modern philosophy matured in the 1700s until the dominant set of views of the era were naturalism, reason and science, tabula rasa, individualism, and liberalism. The Enlightenment was both the dominance of those ideas in intellectual circles and their translation into practice. As a result, individuals were becoming freer, wealthier, living longer, and enjoying more material comfort than at any point before in history. Postmodernism versus the Enlightenment. Postmodernism rejects the entire Enlightenment project. It holds that the modernist premises of the Enlightenment were untenable from the beginning, and that their cultural manifestations have now reached their nadir. While the modern world continues to speak of reason, freedom, and progress, its pathologies tell another story. The postmodern critique of those pathologies is offered as the death knell of modernism. Quote, "The deepest strata of Western culture," unquote, have been exposed, Foucault argues, and are, quote, "once more stirring under our feet," unquote. Accordingly, states Rorty, the postmodern task is to figure out what to do, quote, "now that both the age of faith and the Enlightenment seem beyond recovery," unquote. Postmodernism rejects the Enlightenment project in the most fundamental way possible, by attacking its essential philosophical themes. Postmodernism rejects the reason and the individualism that the entire Enlightenment world depends upon. And so it ends up attacking all of the consequences of the Enlightenment philosophy, from capitalism and liberal forms of government to science and technology. Postmodernism's essentials are the opposite of modernism's. Instead of natural reality, anti-realism. Instead of experience and reason, linguistic social subjectivism. Instead of individual identity and autonomy, various race, sex, and class groupisms. Instead of human interests as fundamentally harmonious and tending toward mutually beneficial interaction, conflict and oppression. Instead of valuing individualism in markets, values, and politics, calls for communalism, solidarity, and egalitarian restraints. Instead of prizing the achievements of science and technology, suspicion tending toward outright hostility. That comprehensive philosophical opposition informs the more specific postmodern themes in the various academic and cultural debates. Postmodern academic themes. Postmodern literary criticism rejects the notion that literary texts have objective meanings and true interpretations. All such claims to objectivity and truth can be deconstructed. In one version of deconstruction, represented by those who agree with the quotation from Stanley Fish earlier, literary criticism becomes a form of subjective play in which the reader pours subjective associations into the text. In another version, objectivity is replaced by the view that an author's race, sex, or other group membership most deeply shapes the author's views and feelings. The task of the literary critic, accordingly, is to deconstruct the text to reveal the author's race, sex, or class interests. Authors and characters who least embody the correct attitudes are naturally subject to the greatest amount of deconstruction. Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, in The Scarlet Letter, seems at least ambivalent about Hester Prynne's moral status, and this ambivalence reveals that he is sold out to an authoritarian, conformist, and repressive masculine religious establishment. Or Herman Melville in Moby Dick may have thought he was exploring universal themes of personal and social ambition, man and nature, but what Captain Ahab really represents is the exploitative authoritarianism of imperialistic patriarchalism and the insane drive of technology to conquer nature. In law, versions of legal pragmatism and critical legal theory embody the new wave. For the pragmatist version of postmodernism, any abstract and universal theory of the law is to be distrusted. Theories are worthwhile only to the extent that they provide the lawyer or judge with useful verbal tools. Standards for usefulness, however, are subjective and variable, so the legal world becomes a postmodernist battleground. As there are no universally valid legal principles of justice, arguments become rhetorical battles of wills. The critical legal theorists represent the race, class, and sex version of legal postmodernism. According to the crits, legal constitutions and precedents are essentially indeterminate, and the so-called objectivity and neutrality of legal reasoning are frauds. All decisions are inherently subjective and driven by preference and politics. The law is a weapon to be used in the social arena of subjective conflict, an arena driven by competing wills and the coercive assertion of one group's interests over those of other groups. In the West, for too long, the law has been a cover for the assertion of white male interests. The only antidote to that poison is the equally forceful assertion of the subjective interests of historically oppressed groups. Stanley Fish marries the pragmatist and crit approaches in arguing that if lawyers and judges come to think of themselves as, quote, supplementers, unquote, rather than, quote, textualists, unquote, they, quote, will be therefore marginally more free than they otherwise would be to infuse into constitutional law their current interpretations of our society's values, unquote. In education, postmodernism rejects the notion that the purpose of education is primarily to train a child's cognitive capacity for reason in order to produce an adult capable of functioning independently in the world. That view of education is replaced with the view that education is to take an essentially indeterminate being and to give it a social identity. Education's method of molding is linguistic, and so the language to be used is that which will create a human being sensitive to its racial, sexual, and class identity. Our current social context, however, is characterized by oppression that benefits whites, males, and the rich at the expense of everyone else. That oppression, in turn, leads to an educational system that reflects only or primarily the interests of those in positions of power. To counteract that bias, education practice must be recast totally. Postmodern education should emphasize works not in the canon. It should focus on the achievements of non-whites, females, and the poor. It should highlight the historical crimes of whites, males, and the rich. And it should teach students that science's method has no better claim to yielding truth than any other method, and, accordingly, that students should be equally receptive to alternative ways of knowing. Postmodern cultural themes. These broad academic themes in turn inform our more specific cultural debates. Whether the Western canon of great books is a distillation of the best of the West and reflective of a multifaceted debate, or whether it is ideologically narrow, exclusive, and intolerant. Whether Christopher Columbus was a modern hero, bringing two worlds together to their mutual benefit, or whether he was an insensitive, smugly superior point man for European imperialism, bringing armed force that rammed European religion and values down indigenous cultures' throats. Whether the United States of America is progressive on liberty, equalities, and opportunities for everyone, or whether it is sexist, racist, and class-bound, for example, using its mass-market pornography and glass ceilings to keep women in their place. Whether our ambivalence over affirmative action programs reflects a strong desire to be fair to all parties, or whether those programs are merely a cynical bone thrown to women and minorities until they seem to be helping, at which point there is a violent reaction by the status quo. Whether social conflicts should be diffused by encouraging the principle that individuals should be judged according to their individual merits and not according to morally irrelevant features such as race or sex. Or whether group identities should be affirmed and celebrated, and whether those who balk at doing so should be sent for mandatory sensitivity training. Whether life in the West, and especially America, is improving, with average longevity and wealth increasing in each generation, or whether America has abandoned its urban underclass and fostered a bland, consumerist culture of shopping malls and suburban sprawl. Whether the liberal West is leading the rest of the world to a freer and more prosperous future, or whether its heavy-handed intrusiveness in foreign policy and its command of the international financial markets are exporting its McJobs to non-Western nations, locking them into the system and destroying their indigenous cultures. Whether science and technology are good for all, extending our knowledge of the universe and making the world healthier, cleaner, and more productive. Or whether science betrays its elitism, sexism, and destructiveness by making the speed of light the fastest phenomenon, therefore unfairly privileging it over other speeds by having chosen the phallic symbol, I, to represent the square root of -1, by asserting its desire to, quote, conquer nature and penetrate her secrets, unquote, and, having done so, by having its technology consummate the rape, by building bigger and longer missiles to blow things up. And whether, in general, liberalism, free markets, technology, and cosmopolitanism are social achievements that can be enjoyed by all cultures, or whether non-Western cultures, since they live simply and in harmony with nature, are superior, and whether the West is arrogantly blind to that fact, being elitist and imperialistic, imposing its capitalism, its science and technology, and its ideology upon other cultures and an increasingly fragile ecosystem. Why postmodernism? What makes all of these debates postmodern is not that the skirmishes are vigorous and heated, but that the terms of the debate have shifted. Modern debates were over truth and reality, reason and experience, liberty and equality, justice and peace, beauty and progress. In the postmodern framework, those concepts always appear in quotation marks. Our most strident voices tell us that, quote, truth, unquote, is a myth. Quote, reason, unquote, is a white male Eurocentric construct. Quote, equality, unquote, is a mask for oppressions. Peace and progress, both quoted, are met with cynical and weary reminders of power or explicit ad hominem attacks. Postmodern debates thus display a paradoxical nature. Across the board, we hear, on the one hand, abstract themes of relativism and egalitarianism. Those themes come in both epistemological and ethical forms. Objectivity is a myth. There is no truth, no right way to read nature or a text. All interpretations are equally valid. Values are socially subjective products. Culturally, therefore, no group's values have special standing. all ways of life from Afghani to Zulu are legitimate. Coexisting with these relativistic and egalitarian themes, we hear, on the other hand, deep chords of cynicism. Principles of civility and procedural justice simply serve as masks for hypocrisy and oppression born of asymmetrical power relations, masks that must be ripped off by crude verbal and physical weapons, ad hominem argument, in-your-face shock tactics, and equally cynical power plays. Disagreements are met not with argument, the benefit of the doubt, and the expectation that reason can prevail, but with assertion, animosity, and a willingness to resort to force. Postmodernism, therefore, is a comprehensive philosophical and cultural movement. It identifies its target, modernism, and its realization in the Enlightenment and its legacy, and it mounts powerful arguments against all of the essential elements of modernism. The existence of any prominent cultural movement raises questions of intellectual history. In the case of postmodernism, independent developments in many intellectual areas, primarily in epistemology and politics, but also in metaphysics, the physical sciences, and our understanding of human nature and values, came together in the middle part of the 20th century. Understanding the development of those independent strands and how and why they came to be woven together is essential to understanding postmodernism. Why is it, for example, that skeptical and relativistic arguments have the cultural power that they do now? Why do they have that power in the humanities but not in the sciences? Why have themes of exhaustion, nihilism, and cynicism come to have the cultural dominance they do? And how can those intellectual themes coexist with a broader culture that is richer, freer, and more vigorous than any culture at any other point in history? Why is it that the leading postmodern thinkers are left in their politics, in most cases far left? And why is it that that prominent segment of the left, the same left that traditionally defended its positions on the modernist grounds of reason, science, fairness for all, and optimism, is now voicing themes of anti-reason, anti-science, all's fair in love and war, and cynicism? The Enlightenment reshaped the entire world, and postmodernism hopes to do the same. Forming such an ambition and developing the arguments capable of mobilizing a movement to realize that ambition is the work of many individuals over several generations. Contemporary second-tier postmodernists, when looking for philosophical support, cite Rorty, Foucault, Lyotard, and Derrida. Those figures, in turn, when looking for heavy-duty philosophical support, cite Martin Heidegger, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Karl Marx, the modern world's most trenchant critics and its most prophetic voices about the new direction. Those figures, in turn, cite George Hegel, Arthur Schopenhauer, Immanuel Kant, and, to a lesser extent, David Hume. The roots and initial impetus of postmodernism thus run deep. The battle between modernism and the philosophies that led to postmodernism was joined at the height of the Enlightenment. Knowing the history of that battle is essential to understanding postmodernism. Explaining Postmodernism, Chapter 2, The Counter-Enlightenment Attack on Reason. Enlightenment Reason, Liberalism, and Science. The Enlightenment developed those features of the modern world that many now take largely for granted: liberal politics and free markets, scientific progress, and technological innovation. All four of those institutions depend upon confidence in the power of reason. Political and economic liberalism depend on confidence that individuals can run their own lives. One gives political power and economic freedom to individuals only to the extent one thinks that they are capable of using it wisely. That confidence in individuals is fundamentally a confidence in the power of reason, reason being the means by which individuals can come to know their world, plan their lives, and interact socially the way that reasonable people do, by trade, discussion, and the force of argument. Science and technology more obviously depend upon confidence in the power of reason. Scientific method is an increasingly refined application of reason to understanding nature. Trusting science's results cognitively is an act of confidence in reason, as is trusting one's life to its technological products. Institutionalizing confidence in the power of reason is the most outstanding achievement of the Enlightenment. One indication of this is that of the thousands of brilliant and hard-working individuals who made the Enlightenment happen, the three men, all of them English, most often identified as being most influential in making the Enlightenment possible are Francis Bacon, for his work on empiricism and scientific method, Isaac Newton, for his work on physics, and John Locke, for his work on reason, empiricism, and liberal politics. Confidence in the power of reason underlay all of their achievements. Their analyses and arguments carried the day, and it was the framework that they developed that provided the intellectual basis for every major development in the 18th century. The beginnings of the Counter-Enlightenment. The Enlightenment confidence in reason, however, upon which all progress had been based, had always been philosophically incomplete and vulnerable. These philosophical weaknesses had emerged clearly by the middle of the 18th century in the skepticism of David Hume's empiricism and the dead end reached by traditional rationalism. The perceived vulnerability of Enlightenment reason was one of the major rallying points for an emerging Counter-Enlightenment. The era from 1780 to 1815 is one of the defining periods of the modern era. During those 35 years, Anglo-American culture and German culture split decisively from each other, one following a broadly Enlightenment program, the other a Counter-Enlightenment one. The Enlightenment had started in England, and it took England from having been a second-rate European power to being a first-rate one. The rest of Europe noticed. Especially the French and the Germans noticed. The French were the first to pick up on the English Enlightenment and to transform brilliantly their own intellectual culture on the basis of it, before the Rousseauians wrested the revolution away from the Lockeans and turned it into the chaos of the Terror. Many Germans, however, had been suspicious of the Enlightenment long before the French Revolution. Some German intellectuals absorbed Enlightenment themes, but most were deeply troubled by its implications for religion, morality, and politics. Enlightenment reason, the critics charged, undermined traditional religion. The leading Enlightenment thinkers were deists, having abandoned the traditional theistic conception of God. God was no longer a personal, caring creator. He was now the supreme mathematician who had, eons ago, designed the universe in terms of the beautiful equations that Johannes Kepler and Newton had discovered. The deists' God operated according to logic and mathematics, not will and whim. The deists' God also seemed to have done his work a long time ago, and to have done it well, meaning that he was no longer needed on the scene to operate the machinery of the universe. Deism thus did two things. It turned God into a distant architect, and it accepted a rational epistemology. Both of those features caused major problems for traditional theism. A distant architect is a far cry from a personal God who is there looking after us or checking up on us day to day. He is not someone we pray to or look to comfort from or fear the wrath of. The deist's God is a bloodless abstraction, not a being that is going to get people fired up in church on Sunday morning and give them a sense of meaning and moral guidance in their lives. An even more important consequence of deism is the loss of faith. To the extent that reason is the standard, faith loses, and the theists of the 18th century knew that. To the extent that reason develops, science develops. And to the extent that science develops, supernaturalistic religious answers to be accepted on faith will be replaced with naturalistic scientific explanations that are rationally compelling. By the middle of the 18th century, everyone had spotted that trend, and everyone knew where it was headed. Even worse, from the perspective of the early Counter-Enlightenment thinkers, was the content of the naturalistic answers that science was giving in the 18th century. Science's most successful models then were mechanistic and reductionistic. When applied to human beings, such models posed an obvious threat to the human spirit. What place is there for free will and passion, spontaneity and creativity, if the world is governed by mechanism and logic, causality and necessity? And what about the value consequences? Reason is a faculty of the individual, and respect for reason and individualism had developed together during the Enlightenment. The individual is an end in himself, the Enlightenment thinkers taught, not a slave or a servant of others. His happiness is his own to pursue. and by giving him the tools of education, science, and technology, he can be set free to set his own goals and to chart his own course in life. But what happens, worried the early Counter-Enlightenment thinkers, to traditional values of community and sacrifice, of duty and connectedness, if individuals are encouraged to calculate rationally their own gain? Will not such rational individualism encourage cold-blooded, short-range, and grasping selfishness? Will it not encourage individuals to reject long-standing traditions and to sever communal ties, thus creating a non-society of isolated, rootless, and restless atoms? The Enlightenment's championing of reason and individualism thus confronted the early Counter-Enlightenment thinkers with the specter of a godless, spiritless, passionless, and amoral future. Horror at that specter was most prevalent among intellectuals in the German states, where the prevailing attitude was hostility toward the Enlightenment. Many drew inspiration from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's collectivist social philosophy. Many drew inspiration from Hume's attack on reason, and many wanted to reinvigorate the German traditions of faith, duty, and ethnic identity that had been undermined by the Enlightenment's emphasis upon reason, the pursuit of happiness, and cosmopolitanism. As the Enlightenment grew in power and prestige in England and France, an emerging Counter-Enlightenment gathered its forces in the German states. Our concern in this chapter and the next is with postmodernism's attack on reason. Postmodernism emerged as a social force among intellectuals because in the humanities, the Counter-Enlightenment defeated the Enlightenment. The weakness of the Enlightenment account of reason was its fatal flaw. Postmodernism's extreme skepticism, subjectivism, and relativism are the results of a 2 centuries-long epistemological battle. That battle is the story of pro-reason intellectuals trying to defend realist accounts of perception, concepts, logic, but gradually giving ground and abandoning the field, while the anti-reason intellectuals advanced in the sophistication of their arguments and developed increasingly non-rational alternatives. Postmodernism is the end result of the Counter-Enlightenment attack on reason. Kant's skeptical conclusion. Immanuel Kant is the most significant thinker of the Counter-Enlightenment. His philosophy, more than any other thinker's, buttressed the pre-modern worldview of faith and duty against the inroads of the Enlightenment, and his attack on Enlightenment reason more than anyone else's opened the door to the 19th century irrationalists and idealist metaphysicians. Kant's innovations in philosophy were thus the beginnings of the epistemological route to postmodernism. Kant is sometimes considered to be an advocate of reason. Kant was in favor of science, it is argued. He emphasized the importance of rational consistency in ethics. He posited regulative principles of reason to guide our thinking, even our thinking about religion. And he resisted the ravings of Johann Hamann and the relativism of Johann Heidegger. Thus the argument runs, Kant should be placed in the pantheon of Enlightenment greats. That is a mistake. The fundamental question of reason is its relationship to reality. Is reason capable of knowing reality, or is it not? Is our rational faculty a cognitive function, taking its material from reality, understanding the significance of that material, and using that understanding to guide our actions in reality, or is it not? This is the question that divides philosophers into pro- and anti-reason camps. This is the question that divides the rational Gnostics and the skeptics, and this was Kant's question in his critique of pure reason. Kant was crystal clear about his answer. Reality, real noumenal reality, is forever closed off to reason, and reason is limited to awareness and understanding of its own subjective products. Reason has, quote, no other purpose than to prescribe its own formal rule for the extension of its empirical employment, and not any extension beyond all limits of empirical employment, unquote. Limited to knowledge of phenomena that it itself has constructed according to its own design, reason cannot know anything outside of itself. Contrary to the, quote, dogmatists, unquote, who had for centuries held out hope for knowledge of reality itself, Kant concluded that, quote, The dogmatic solution is therefore not only uncertain, but impossible, unquote. Thus Kant, that great champion of reason, asserted that the most important fact about reason is that it is clueless about reality. Part of Kant's motivation was religious. He saw the beating that religion had taken at the hands of the Enlightenment thinkers, and he agreed strongly with them that religion cannot be justified by reason. So he realized that we need to decide which has priority, reason or religion. Kant firmly chose religion. This meant that reason had to be put in its proper subordinate place. And so, as he stated famously in the second preface to the first critique, quote, "I here therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith," unquote. One purpose of the critique, accordingly, was to limit severely the scope of reason. By closing noumenal reality off to reason, all rational arguments against the existence of God could be dismissed. If reason could be shown to be limited to the merely phenomenal realm, then the noumenal realm, the realm of religion, would be off limits to reason, and those arguing against religion could be told to be quiet and go away. Kant's problematic from empiricism and rationalism. In addition to his religious concerns, Kant was also grappling with the problems that the empiricists and the rationalists had run into in attempting to develop satisfactory accounts of reason. For all of their differences, the empiricists and rationalists had agreed with the broadly Enlightenment conception of reason, that human reason is a faculty of the individual, that it is competent to know reality objectively, that it is capable of functioning autonomously and in accordance with universal principles. Reason so conceived underlay their confidence in science, human dignity, and the perfectibility of human institutions. Of those 5 features of reason, objectivity, competence, autonomy, universality, and being an individual faculty, Kant concluded that the sad experience of recent philosophy demonstrated that the most fundamental of them, objectivity, must be abandoned. The failures of empiricism and rationalism had shown that objectivity is impossible. For reason to be objective, it must have contact with reality. The most obvious candidate for such direct contact is sense perception. On realist accounts, the senses give us our most direct contact with reality, and they thereby provide the material that reason then organizes and integrates into concepts. Those concepts in turn becoming integrated into propositions and theories. If, however, the senses give us only internal representations of objects, then an obstacle is erected between reality and reason. If reason is presented with an internal sensory representation of reality, then it is not directly aware of reality. Reality then becomes something to be inferred or hoped for beyond a veil of sense perception. 2 arguments had traditionally generated the conclusion that we are aware only of internal sensory representations. The first was based on the fact that sense perception is a causal process. Since it is a causal process, the argument ran, it seems that one's reason comes to be aware of an internal state at the end of the causal process, and not of the external object that initiated the process. The senses, unfortunately, get in the way of our consciousness of reality. The second argument was based on the fact that the features of sense perception vary from individual to individual and across time for any given individual. One individual sees an object as red, while another sees it as gray. An orange tastes sweet, but not after tasting a spoonful of sugar. What then is the real color of the object, or the real taste of the orange? It seems that neither can be said to be the real feature. Instead, each sense perception must be merely a subjective effect, and one's reason must be aware only of the subjective effect and not the external object. What both of these arguments have in common is a recognition of the uncontroversial fact that our sense organs have an identity, that they work in specific ways, and that the form in which we experience reality is a function of our sense organs' identities. And they have in common the crucial and controversial premise that our sense organs having an identity means that they become obstacles to direct consciousness of reality. This latter premise was critical for Kant's analysis. The empiricists had drawn from this analysis of sense perception the conclusion that while we must rely on our sense perceptions, we must always be tentative with regard to our confidence in them. From sense perception, we can draw no certain conclusions. The rationalists had drawn the conclusion that sense experience is useless as a significant source of truths, and that for the source of such truths, we must look elsewhere. This brings us to abstract concepts. The empiricists, stressing the experiential source of all of our beliefs, had held that concepts too must be contingent, as based on sense perception, concepts are 2 stages removed from reality, and so less certain. And as groupings based on our choices, concepts are human artifices, so they and the propositions generated from them can have no necessity or universality ascribed to them. The rationalists, agreeing that necessary and universal concepts could not be derived from sense experience, but insisting that we do have necessary and universal knowledge, had concluded that our concepts must have a source somewhere other than in sense experience. The problematic implication of this was that if concepts did not have their source in sense experience, then it was hard to see how they could have any application to the sensory realm. What these 2 analyses of concepts had in common is the following hard choice. If we think of concepts as telling us something universal and necessary, then we have to think of them as having nothing to do with the world of sense experience. And if we think of the concepts as having something to do with the world of sense experience, then we have to abandon the idea of knowing any real, universal, and necessary truths. In other words, experience and necessity have nothing to do with each other. This premise, too, was critical for Kant's analysis. The rationalists and the empiricists had jointly struck a blow to the Enlightenment confidence in reason. Reason works with concepts. But now we were told to accept either that reason's concepts have little to do with the world of sense experience, in which case science's conception of itself as generating universal and necessary truths about the world of sense experience was in big trouble, or we were told to accept that reason's concepts are merely provisional and contingent groupings of sense experience, in which case science's conception of itself as generating universal and necessary truths about the world of sense experience was in big trouble. Thus, by the time of Kant, the Enlightenment philosophers' account of reason was faltering on 2 counts. Given their analysis of sense perception, reason seemed cut off from direct access to reality. And given their analysis of concepts, reason seemed either irrelevant to reality or limited to merely contingent truths. Kant's significance in the history of philosophy is that he absorbed the lessons of the rationalists and empiricists and, agreeing with the central assumptions of both sides, transformed radically the terms of the relationship between reason and reality. Kant's essential argument. Kant began by identifying a premise common to both empiricists and rationalists. They had assumed that knowledge must be objective. That is, they took for granted that the object of knowledge sets the terms, and therefore that it was up to the subject to identify the object on the object's terms. In other words, the empiricists and the rationalists were realists. They believed that reality is what it is independently of consciousness, and that the purpose of consciousness is to come to an awareness of reality as it is. In Kant's terms, they assumed that the subject is to conform to the object. Kant then noted that the realist objectivist assumption had led repeatedly to failure, and, more strikingly, that it must necessarily lead to failure. To demonstrate this, Kant proposed a dilemma for all analyses of knowledge. The first premise of the dilemma is given at the beginning of the transcendental deduction. Here Kant states that the knowledge of objects can come to be only in one of 2 ways. Quote, "There are only 2 possible ways in which synthetic representations, that is, what one experiences, and their objects can establish connection, obtain necessary relation to one another, and, as it were, meet one another. Either the object alone must make the representation possible, or the representation alone must make the object possible." Unquote. The terms of the dilemma are crucial, particularly for the first alternative. If we say that, quote, "the object alone must make the representation possible," then we imply that the subject must have nothing to do with the process. The implication is that the subject can have no identity of its own, that the mind must not be anything in particular, that consciousness must be, to borrow a phrase, a purely, quote, diaphanous medium, unquote, on which or through which reality writes itself. In other words, Kant assumed, as had most thinkers before him, that objectivity presupposes naive realism's metaphysics of an identityless subject. But clearly that metaphysics of mind is hopeless. This was Kant's next premise. The knowing subject is something. Its processes are causal and definite, and they shape the subject's awareness. In Kant's words, when we experience, quote, we always remain involved in conditions, unquote, conditions that make our experiences, quote, a finite synthesis, unquote. This is why naive realism has been an impossible project. The knowing subject is not a blank, identityless tablet, so it cannot be that the object alone makes knowledge possible. Given its finite identity, the knowing subject is implicated in producing its experience, and from the limited and conditioned experiences that are produced, the subject cannot read off what is really real. Thus we arrive at the second alternative, the one that Kant proposed as being true, namely that the representation makes the object possible. And thus we have part of the motivation for Kant's, quote, Copernican, unquote, revolution in philosophy, announced in the second preface. Given that the knowing subject has an identity, we must abandon the traditional assumption that the subject conforms to the object. Accordingly, the converse must be true. The object must conform to the subject, and only if we make that assumption, that is, only if we abandon objectivity for subjectivity, can we make sense of empirical knowledge. The second part of Kant's motivation was attempting to make sense of necessary and universal concepts and propositions. Neither the rationalists nor the empiricists had found a way to derive them from experience. Kant again faulted their assumption of realism and objectivism. Those assumptions made the project impossible. Quote, in the former case, that is, the object alone making the representation possible, this relation is only empirical, and the representation is never possible a priori, unquote. Or, putting the point in language Kant had learned from Hume, passive experience will never reveal what must be, for such experience, quote, teaches us that a thing is so-and-so, but not that it cannot be otherwise, unquote. So again, we must infer that the converse is true. Necessity and universality must be functions of the knowing subject, not items impressed upon subjects by objects. If we assume that our identity as knowing subjects is implicated in constructing our experiences, then we can assume that our identity will generate certain necessary and universal features of our experiences. Accordingly, we have Kant's central project in the first critique of tracking down 14 such constructive functions of the subject, space and time, as two forms of sensibility, and the 12 categories. As a result of the operations of those constructive functions, we can find necessary and universal features within our experiential world because we have put them there. Now for the payoffs and trade-offs. The first payoff is that the phenomenal world of experience now has necessary and universal features built into it. So we get a nice, orderly world for science to explore. Science is rescued from the unintended skepticism that the empiricists and rationalists had reached, and its aspiration to discover necessary and universal truths is made possible. But there is also the Kantian trade-off. The objects that science explores exist, quote, only in our brain, unquote. So we can never come to know the world outside it. Since the phenomenal world's necessary and universal features are a function of our subjective activities, any necessary and universal features that science discovers in the phenomenal world have application only in the phenomenal world. Science must work with experience and reason, and on Kantian grounds, this means that science is cut off from reality itself. Quote, everything intuited in space or time, and therefore all objects of experience possible to us, are nothing but appearances, that is, mere representations, which, in the manner in which they are represented, as extended beings or as series of alterations, have no independent existence outside our thoughts." Unquote. As for what has independent existence outside our thoughts, nobody knows or can know. From Kant's perspective, that is a trade-off he was happy to make, for science's loss is religion's gain. Kant's argument, if successful, means that, quote, "all objections to morality and religion will be forever silenced," and this in Socratic fashion, namely by the clearest proof of the ignorance of the objectors, unquote. Reason and science are now limited to playing with phenomena, leaving the noumenal realm untouched and untouchable. Having denied knowledge, room was made for faith. For who can say what is or is not out there in the real world? Identifying Kant's key assumptions. Kant's strikingly skeptical conclusions depend upon philosophical assumptions that continue to inform contemporary debates between postmodernists and their foes. Most postmodernists take those assumptions to be solid, and many times their foes are at a loss to challenge them. Yet they are the assumptions that must be addressed if postmodernist conclusions are to be avoided, so it is worth highlighting them for future reference. The first assumption is that the knowing subject's having an identity is an obstacle to cognition. This assumption is implicit in many verbal formulations. The critics of objectivity will insist that the mind is not a diaphanous medium, nor is it a glossy mirror within which reality reflects itself, nor is it a passive tablet upon which reality writes. The assumption emerges when those facts are taken to disqualify the subject from awareness of reality. The assumption then is that for awareness of reality to occur, the mind would have to be a diaphanous medium, a glossy mirror, or a passive tablet. In other words, the mind would have to have no identity of its own. It would have to be nothing in itself, and cognition would have to involve no causal processes. The mind's identity and its causal processes are thus taken to be enemies of cognition. The diaphanous assumption is implicit in the relativity and causality of perception arguments that were part of the background problematic to Kant's philosophy. In the relativity of senses argument, the diaphanous assumption plays out as follows. We notice that one person reports seeing an object as red, while another reports seeing it as gray. This puzzles us because it draws our attention to the fact that our sense organs differ in how they respond to reality. This as an epistemological puzzle, however, only if we assume that our sense organs should have nothing to do with our awareness of reality, that somehow awareness should occur by a pure stamping of reality upon our transparent minds. That is, it is a problem only if we assume our senses should operate diaphanously. In the case of the causality of perception argument, the diaphanous assumption is involved if we are puzzled by the fact that consciousness requires that one's brain be in a certain state, and that between that brain state and the object in reality is a causal process involving sense organs. This is puzzling only if we have previously assumed that awareness should be an unmediated phenomenon, that one's brain being in the appropriate state should somehow just happen. That is, the causal process of perception is a puzzle only on the assumption that our senses should have no identity of their own, but rather be a diaphanous medium. In the arguments based on the relativity and the causality of perception, the identity of our sense organs is taken to be the enemy of awareness of reality. Kant generalized this point to all organs of consciousness. The subject's mind is not diaphanous. It has an identity. It has structures that limit what the subject can be aware of, and they are causally active. From this, Kant inferred that the subject is prohibited from awareness of reality, whatever we take our mind's identity to be. In Kant's case, the forms of sensibility and the categories, those causal processes block us. On the Kantian model, our mind's structures are seen not as existing for the purpose of registering or responding to structures that exist in reality, but as existing for the purpose of imposing themselves upon a malleable reality. The question to return to is there not something perverse about making our organs of consciousness obstacles to consciousness? The second key assumption of Kant's argument is that abstractness, universality, and necessity have no legitimate basis in our experiences. This assumption was not original to Kant, but had a long history in the traditional problem of universals and the problem of induction. Kant, however, following Hume, declared the problems to be in principle unsolvable on the realist objectivist approach, and he institutionalized that declaration in the subsequent history of philosophy. In the case of abstract universal concepts, the argument was that there is no way to account for their abstractness and universality empirically. Since what is given empirically is concrete and particular, abstractness and universality must be added subjectively. The parallel argument in the case of general and necessary propositions was that there was no way to account for their generality and necessity empirically. Since what is given empirically is particular and contingent, generality and necessity must be subjectively added. Institutionalizing this premise is crucial for postmodernism, since what has been added subjectively can be taken away subjectively. Postmodernists, struck by and favoring contingency and particularity for a host of reasons, accept the Humean Kantian premise that neither abstractness nor generality can be derived legitimately from the empirical. Why Kant is the turning point. Kant was the decisive break with the Enlightenment and the first major step toward postmodernism. Contrary to the Enlightenment account of reason, Kant held that the mind is not a response mechanism, but a constitutive mechanism. He held that the mind, and not reality, sets the terms for knowledge. And he held that reality conforms to reason, not vice versa. In the history of philosophy, Kant marks a fundamental shift from objectivity as the standard to subjectivity as the standard. Wait a minute, a defender of Kant may reply. Kant was hardly opposed to reason. After all, he favored rational consistency, and he believed in universal principles. So what is anti-reason about that? The answer is that more fundamental to reason than consistency and universality is a connection to reality. Any thinker who concludes that in principle reason cannot know reality is not fundamentally an advocate of reason. That Kant was in favor of consistency and universality is of derivative and ultimately inconsequential significance. Consistency with no connection to reality is a game based on subjective rules. If the rules of the game have nothing to do with reality, then why should everybody play by the same rules? These were precisely the implications the postmodernists were to draw eventually. Kant was thus different from earlier skeptics and religious apologists. Many earlier skeptics had denied that we can know anything, and many earlier religious apologists had subordinated reason to faith. But earlier skeptics had never been as sweeping in their conclusions. Earlier skeptics would identify particular cognitive operations and raise problems for them. Maybe a given experience is a perceptual illusion, thus undermining our confidence in our perceptual faculties. Maybe it is a dream, thus undermining our confidence in being able to distinguish truth from fantasy. Or maybe induction is only probabilistic, thus undermining our confidence in our generalizations, and so on. But the conclusion of those skeptical arguments would be merely that we cannot be sure that we are right about the way reality is. We might be, but we cannot guarantee it, the skeptics would conclude. Kant's point was deeper, arguing that in principle, any conclusion reached by any of our faculties must necessarily not be about reality. Any form of cognition, because it must operate a certain way, cannot put us in contact with reality. On principle, because our mind's faculties are structured a certain way, we cannot say what reality is. We can only say how our minds have structured the subjective reality we perceive. This thesis had been implicit in the works of some earlier thinkers, including Aristotle's, but Kant made it explicit and drew the conclusion systematically. Kant is a landmark in a second respect. Earlier skeptics had, despite their negative conclusions, continued to conceive of truth as correspondence to reality. Kant went a step further and redefined truth on subjective grounds. Given his premises, this makes perfect sense. Truth is an epistemological concept. But if our minds are in principle disconnected from reality, then to speak of truth as an external relationship between mind and reality is nonsense. Truth must be solely an internal relationship of consistency. With Kant, then, external reality thus drops almost totally out of the picture, and we are trapped inescapably in subjectivity. And that is why Kant is a landmark. Once reason is in principle severed from reality, one then enters a different philosophical universe altogether. This interpretive point about Kant is crucial and controversial. An analogy may help drive the point home. Suppose a thinker argued the following, quote, "I am an advocate of freedom for women. Options and the power to choose among them are crucial to our human dignity, and I am wholeheartedly an advocate of a woman's human dignity. But we must understand that the scope of a woman's choice is confined to the kitchen. Beyond the kitchen's door, she must not attempt to exercise choice. Within the kitchen, however, she has a whole feast of choices, whether to cook or clean, whether to cook rice or potatoes, whether to decorate in blue or yellow. She is sovereign and autonomous, and the mark of a good woman is a well-organized and tidy kitchen." Unquote. No one would mistake such a thinker for an advocate of woman's freedom. Anyone would point out that there is a whole world beyond the kitchen, and that freedom is essentially about exercising choice, about defining and creating one's place in the world as a whole. The key point about Kant, to draw the analogy crudely, is that he prohibits knowledge of anything outside our skulls. He gives reason lots to do within the skull, and he does advocate a well-organized and tidy mind, but this hardly makes him a champion of reason. The point for any advocate of reason is that there is a whole world outside our skulls, and reason is essentially about knowing it. Kant's contemporary, Moses Mendelssohn, was thus prescient in identifying Kant as, quote, "the all-destroyer," unquote. Kant did not take all of the steps down the road to postmodernism, but he did take the decisive one. Of the 5 major features of Enlightenment reason, objectivity, competence, autonomy, universality, and being an individual faculty, Kant rejects objectivity. Once reason is so severed from reality, the rest is details that are worked out over the next 2 centuries. By the time we get to the postmodern account, reason is seen not only as subjective, but also as incompetent, highly contingent, relative, and collective. Between Kant and the postmodernists comes the successive abandonment of the rest of reason's features. After Kant, reality or reason, but not both. Kant's legacy to the next generation is a principled separation of subject and object, of reason and reality. His philosophy is thus a forerunner of postmodernism's strong anti-realist and anti-reason stances. After Kant, the story of philosophy is the story of German philosophy. Kant died early in the 19th century, just as Germany was beginning to replace France as the world's leading intellectual nation, and it was German philosophy that set the program for the 19th century. Understanding German philosophy is crucial to understanding the origins of postmodernism. Continental postmodernists such as Foucault and Derrida will cite Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Hegel as their major formative influences, all of them German thinkers. American postmodernists such as Rorty emerged primarily from the collapse of the logical positivist tradition, but will also cite Heidegger and pragmatism as major formative influences. When we look to the roots of logical positivism, we find cultural Germans such as Wittgenstein and the members of the Vienna Circle. And when we look at pragmatism, we find it to be an Americanized version of Kantianism and Hegelianism. Postmodernism is thus the supplanting of the Enlightenment with its roots in 17th century English philosophy by the Counter-Enlightenment with its roots in late 18th century German philosophy. Kant is central to that story. By the time of his death, Kant's philosophy had conquered the German intellectual world. And so the story of German philosophy became the story of extensions and reactions to Kant. Three broad strains of post-Kantian philosophy emerged. What shall we do, members of each strain asked, about the gulf between subject and object that Kant has said cannot be crossed by reason? First, Kant's closest followers decided to accept the gulf and live with it. Neo-Kantianism evolved during the 19th century, and by the 20th century, two main forms had emerged. One form was structuralism, of which Ferdinand de Saussure was a prominent exponent, representing the broadly rationalist wing of Kantianism. The other was phenomenology, of which Edmund Husserl was a prominent representative, representing the broadly empiricist wing of Kantianism. Structuralism was a linguistic version of Kantianism, holding that language is a self-contained, non-referential system, and that the philosophical task was to seek out language's necessary and universal structural features, those features taken to underlie and be prior to the empirical, contingent features of language. Phenomenology's focus was upon careful examination of the contingent flow of the experiential given, avoiding any existential inferences or assumptions about what one experiences, and seeking simply to describe experience as neutrally and as clearly as possible. In effect, the structuralists were seeking subjective noumenal categories, and the phenomenologists were content with describing the phenomena without asking what connection to an external reality those experiences might have. Structuralism and phenomenology came to prominence in the 20th century, however, and so my focus next will be on the two strains of German philosophy that dominated the 19th century. For those two strains, Kant's philosophy set a problem to be solved, though one to be solved within the constraints of Kant's most fundamental premises. Second, the speculative metaphysical strain, best represented by Hegel, was dissatisfied with the principled separation of subject and object. This strain granted Kant's claim that the separation cannot be bridged epistemologically by reason, and so proposed to bridge it metaphysically by identifying the subject with the object. Third, the irrationalist strain, best represented by Kierkegaard, was also dissatisfied with the principled separation of subject and object. It granted Kant's claim that the separation cannot be bridged epistemologically by reason, and so proposed to bridge it epistemologically by irrational means. Kantian philosophy thus set the stage for the reign of speculative metaphysics and epistemological irrationalism in the 19th century. Metaphysical solutions to Kant, from Hegel to Nietzsche. Georg W. F. Hegel's philosophy is another fundamentally counter-Enlightenment attack on reason and individualism. His philosophy is a partially secularized version of traditional Judeo-Christian cosmology. While Kant's concerns centered upon epistemology, Hegel's centered upon metaphysics. For Kant, preserving faith led him to deny reason, while for Hegel, preserving the spirit of Judeo-Christian metaphysics led him to be more anti-reason and anti-individualist than Kant ever was. Hegel agreed with Kant that realism and objectivism were dead ends. Kant had transcended them by making the subject prior, but from Hegel's perspective, he had been too wishy-washy in doing so. Kant made the subject responsible only for the phenomenal world of experience, leaving noumenal reality forever closed off to us. This was intolerable to Hegel. After all, the whole point of philosophy is to achieve union with reality, to escape the merely sensuous and finite, and to come to know and be one with the supersensuous and infinite. However, Hegel had no intention of trying to solve the epistemological puzzles about perception, concept formation, and induction that had set Kant's agenda, in order to show us how we might acquire knowledge of the noumenal. Instead, taking a cue from Johann Fichte, Hegel's strategy was to assert boldly an identity of subject and object, thus closing the gap metaphysically. On Kantian grounds, the subject is responsible for the form of awareness, but Kant was still enough of a realist to posit a noumenal reality that was the source of the content that our minds shape and structure. For Hegel, the realist element drops out entirely. The subject generates both content and form. The subject is in no way responsive to an external reality. Instead, the whole of reality is a creation of the subject. Quote, "In my view," unquote, Hegel wrote at the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit, quote, "which can be justified only by the exposition of the system itself, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject," unquote. The subject, with a capital S, that Hegel had in mind is not the empirical individual subject of traditional philosophy. The creative subject, that is also substance, is the universe as a whole, or God, or spirit, or the absolute, of which we individual subjects are mere portions. Realists had seen the universe as a whole as an object or set of objects within which there are some subjects. Hegel reversed that. The universe as a whole is a subject, and within the subject are objects. Such a bold posit solves a lot of problems. We can get even more necessity and universality than Kant had given us. Hume, earlier, had told us that we cannot get necessary and universal truths from reality. Kant, agreeing with Hume's conclusion, had suggested that we supply necessity and universality from ourselves. That grounded necessity and universality, but at a price. Since we supply them subjectively, we cannot be sure that they apply to reality. Hegel agreed with Kant that our minds supply necessity and universality, but said that all of reality is a product of mind, the mind that contains all of our little minds within it. Since reality comes from us, we can know all of reality in all of its glorious necessity. We can also get a universe that does not dehumanize us. Hegel argued that the realist and objectivist models had, by separating subject and object, inevitably led to mechanical and reductionist accounts of the self. By taking the everyday objects of empirical reality as the model and explaining everything in terms of them, they necessarily had to reduce the subject to a mechanical device. But if instead we start with the subject and not the object, then our model of reality changes significantly. The subject, we know from the inside, is conscious and organic, and if the subject is a microcosm of the whole, then applying its features to the whole generates a conscious and organic model of the world. Such a model of the world is much more hospitable to traditional values than the materialist and reductionist leanings of the Enlightenment. Hegel could also claim to be more of an advocate of reason than Kant was. Reason, Kant taught us, is fundamentally a creative function, and Kant also taught us it can know only its own phenomenal creations. But having asserted that reason creates all of reality, Hegel could offer the very optimistic, Enlightenment-sounding conclusion that reason can know all of reality. Dialectic and saving religion. We are now, however, talking about a very different reason than the Enlightenment one. Hegel's reason is fundamentally a creative function, not a cognitive one. It does not come to know a pre-existing reality. It brings all of reality into existence. More notoriously, Hegel's reason operates by dialectical and contradictory means, and not in accordance with the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction. Hegel's dialectic is partly driven by the fact that by the early 19th century, evolutionary ideas are in the air. In contrast to Kant's belief that the subjective categories of reason are necessarily unchanging and universal, Hegel argued that the appropriate categories themselves are changeable. But Hegel's dialectic is a special kind of evolution, one designed less to be responsive to discoveries in biology than to square with Judeo-Christian cosmology. Judeo-Christian cosmology had traditionally been plagued by metaphysical assertions that were repugnant to reason. Respect for reason during the Enlightenment had led accordingly to a significant decline in religious belief among the intellectuals. Aristotelian reason cannot countenance a God that creates something out of nothing, that is both three and one, that is perfect but creates a world that contains evil, Accordingly, the thrust of Enlightenment theology had been to alter religion by eliminating its contradictory theses in order to make it compatible with reason. Hegel's strategy was to accept that Judeo-Christian cosmology is rife with contradictions, but to alter reason in order to make it compatible with contradiction. Here, Hegel made another significant step beyond Kant and further away from the Enlightenment. Kant had come close to the truth, Hegel believed, in developing the antinomies of reason in the first critique. Kant's purpose there was to show that reason is out of its depth when it tries to figure out noumenal truths about reality. He did so by developing 4 pairs of parallel arguments on 4 metaphysical issues, and by showing that in each case reason leads to contradictory conclusions. One can prove that the universe must have had a beginning in time, but one can equally soundly prove that the universe must be eternal. One can prove that the world must be made up of simplest parts, and also that it cannot be, that we have free will, and that strict determinism is true, that God must exist, and that he does not exist. These contradictions of reason show, Kant concluded, that reason can never know reality, and that therefore our reason is limited to structuring and manipulating its subjective creations. Hegel thought that Kant had missed a deep point here. The antinomies are not a problem for reason, contrary to Kant, but rather the key to the whole universe. The antinomies of reason are a problem only if one thinks that logical contradictions are a problem. That was Kant's mistake. He was too trapped in the old Aristotelian logic of non-contradiction. What Kant's antinomies show is not that reason is limited, but rather that we need a new and better kind of reason, one that embraces contradictions and sees the whole of reality as evolving out of contradictory forces. Such a conception of contradictory evolution is compatible with Judeo-Christian cosmology. That cosmology begins with a creation ex nihilo, posits a perfect being that generates evil, believes in a just being that gives humans independent judgment, but punishes them for using it, includes accounts of virgin births and other miracles, says that the infinite becomes finite, the immaterial becomes material, the essentially unitary becomes plural, and so on. Given the primacy of that metaphysics, reason must give way. Reason, for example, must be adapted to the demands of this metaphysics of creation. Quote, "As yet, there is nothing, and there is to become something. The beginning is not pure nothing, but a nothing from which something is to proceed. Therefore, being too is already contained in the beginning. The beginning, therefore, contains both. Being and nothing is the unity of being and nothing, or is non-being which is at the same time being, and being which is at the same time non-being." Unquote. While that account of creation is incoherent from the perspective of Aristotelian reason, such a poetically grand-sounding drama of evolution by contradiction is perfectly rational, if one grants that reason contains within itself contradiction. That analysis consists in seeking the implicit contradiction within anything and teasing it out in order to put the contradictory elements explicitly in tension with each other, thus leading to a resolution that both goes beyond the contradiction to another evolutionary stage, while at the same time preserving the original contradiction, whatever that means. Hegel thus explicitly rejected Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. Absolutely everything depends on, quote, "the identity of identity and non-identity," unquote, Hegel wrote in The Science of Logic. Hegelian dialectical reason also differs from Enlightenment reason by implying a strong relativism against the universality of Enlightenment reason. For all of Hegel's talk of the ultimate universal perspective of the absolute, from any other perspective, nothing holds for long. Dialectic injects contradiction into reality at any given time, as well as across eras. If everything is evolving by the clash of contradictions, then what is metaphysically and epistemologically true in one epoch will be contradicted by what is true in the next, and so on. Finally,
Hegel's reason differs from Enlightenment reason by not only being creative of reality and embracing contradiction, but also by being a fundamentally collective function rather than an individual one. Here again, Hegel went beyond Kant in rejecting the Enlightenment. While Kant preserved some elements of individual autonomy, Hegel rejected those elements. Just as the Judeo-Christian cosmology sees everything as God working out his plan for the world in, around, and through us, for Hegel, individuals' minds and whole being are a function of the deeper forces of the universe, operating upon them and through them. Individuals are constructed by their surrounding cultures, cultures that have an evolutionary life of their own, those cultures themselves being a function of yet still deeper cosmic forces. The individual is a tiny, emergent aspect of the largest whole, the collective subjects working itself out, and the creation of reality occurs at that level with little or no regard for the individual. The individual is merely along for the ride. Speaking in Philosophy of History of collective reason's operations, Hegel stated that as, quote, universal reason does realize itself. We have, indeed, nothing to do with the individual empirically regarded, unquote. Quote, this good, this reason in its most concrete form is God. God governs the world. The actual working of his government, the carrying out of his plan, is the history of the world, unquote. Hegel's contribution to postmodernism. Hegel's place historically is to have institutionalized 4 theses in 19th century metaphysics. 1. Reality is an entirely subjective creation. 2. Contradictions are built into reason and reality. 3. Since reality evolves contradictorily, truth is relative to time and place. And 4. The collective, not the individual, is the operative unit. Hegel's influence was and is profound upon future metaphysicians. Among those metaphysicians, fierce debates emerged over secondary theses. Was the clash of contradiction ultimately progressive, as Hegel thought? Or was Hegel willfully blinding himself to the totally irrational chaos that Schopenhauer believed reality to be? Was the ontological substrate of clash and contradiction ideal, as Hegel held? Or was it material, as Marx argued? Was the process as totally collectivizing as Hegel took it to be? Or were there some individualist elements within an overall collectivizing framework, as Nietzsche asserted? Whatever the variations, the metaphysical themes of clash and conflict, of truth as relative, of reason as limited and constructed, and of collectivism were dominant. For all of their differences with Hegel, postmodernists adopt all 4 of those theses. Epistemological solutions to Kant. Irrationalism from Kierkegaard to Nietzsche. The Kantians and the Hegelians represent the pro-reason contingent in 19th century German philosophy. While the Hegelians pursued metaphysical solutions to Kant's unbridgeable gap between subject and object, in the process altering reason into something unrecognizable to the Enlightenment, they had competition from the explicitly irrationalist wing of German philosophy. This line of development included major figures such as Friedrich Schleiermacher, Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Denmark's lonely contribution to the history of modern philosophy, Soren Kierkegaard. The irrationalists divided over whether religion is true. The irrationalists divided over whether religion is true, Schleiermacher and Kierkegaard being theists, and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche being atheists, but all shared a contempt for reason. All condemned reason as a totally artificial and limiting faculty, one that must be abandoned in the bold quest to embrace reality. Perhaps Kant had prohibited access to reality, but he had shown only that reason could not get us there. That left other options open to us: faith, feeling, and instinct. Schleiermacher, 1768 to 1834, came of age in a Kant-dominated intellectual scene, and he took Kant's cue for how religion could respond to the threat of the Enlightenment. Intellectually, most active from 1799, with the publication of On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultural Despisers, Schleiermacher more than anyone made happen the revival of pietism and Orthodox Protestantism over the course of the next generation. So great was Schleiermacher's influence that, as theologian Richard Niebuhr put it, he, quote, may justifiably be called the Kant of modern Protestantism, unquote. As someone who came of age in the 1790s in Germany, Schleiermacher was broadly Kantian in his approach, embraced wholeheartedly the Kantian rejection of reason's access to reality. Schleiermacher, like Kant, was deeply offended by the assault that reason, science, and naturalism had made on the true faith. Following Hamann, Schleiermacher held that feeling, especially religious feeling, is a mode of cognition, one that gives us access to noumenal reality. Except, argued Schleiermacher, these feelings are not so much directed outward as inward. One cannot grasp noumena directly, but one can phenomenologically inspect oneself, one's deepest feelings, and therein find indirect senses of the divine ultimate. As Hamann had stated, directly confronted religious feeling reveals one's essential nature. When one discovers one's essential nature, the core self-feeling that one is forced to accept is that of absolute dependence. In Schleiermacher's words, quote, the essence of religion is the feeling of absolute dependence. I repudiated rational thought in favor of a theology of feeling, unquote. One should strive to realize oneself by exploring and embracing this feeling of absolute dependence. This required attacking reason, for reason gives one a feeling of independence and confidence. Limiting reason is thus the essence of religious piety, for it makes possible a fully entered into feeling of dependence and orientation toward that being upon which one is absolutely dependent. That being is, of course, God. In the next generation, Kierkegaard, quote, Hamann's most brilliant and profound disciple, unquote, gave irrationality an activist twist. Educated in Germany, Kierkegaard was, like Kant, deeply worried by the beating religion had taken during the Enlightenment. So he was cheered, or at least as cheered as Kierkegaard could ever be, to learn from Kant that reason cannot reach the noumena. The Enlightenment thinkers had said that individuals relate to reality as knowers. On the basis of their acquired knowledge, individuals then act to better themselves and their world. Quote, knowledge is power, unquote, wrote Bacon. But after Kant, we know that knowledge of reality is impossible. So while we must still act in the real world, we do not and cannot have the necessary knowledge upon which to base our choices. And since our entire destinies are at stake in the choices we make, we cannot choose dispassionately between options. We must choose, and choose passionately, all the while knowing that we are choosing in ignorance. For Kierkegaard, the core lesson from Kant was that one must not try to relate to reality cognitively. What is needed is action, commitment, a leap into that which one cannot know, but which one feels is essential to give meaning to one's life. In accordance with Kierkegaard's felt religious needs, what is needed is an irrational leap of faith. It must be a leap because after the Enlightenment it is clear that the existence of God cannot be justified rationally. And it must be irrational because the God that Kierkegaard finds compelling is absurd. But such a leap into the absurd puts one in a crisis. It flies in the face of everything sensible, rational, and moral. So how should one deal with this crisis of both wanting and not wanting to leap into absurdity? In Fear and Trembling, we find Kierkegaard's panegyric to Abraham, a hero of the Hebrew Scriptures who, in defiance of all reason and morality, was willing to turn off his mind and kill his son Isaac. Why? Because God ordered him to. How could that be? Would a good God make such a demand of a man? That makes God incomprehensibly cruel. What about God's promise that through Isaac the future generations of Israel would be born? The demand makes God a promise breaker. What about the fact that it is killing an innocent? That makes God immoral. What about the immense pain that the loss of their son would cause in Abraham and Sarah? That makes God a sadist. Does Abraham rebel? No. Does he even question? No. He shuts down his mind and obeys. That, said Kierkegaard, is the essence of our cognitive relation to reality. Like Abraham, each of us must learn, quote, to relinquish his understanding and his thinking, and to keep his soul fixed upon the absurd, unquote. Like Abraham, we do not know and we cannot know. What we must do is jump blindly into the unknown. Kierkegaard revered Abraham as, quote, a knight of faith, unquote, for his willingness to, quote, crucify reason, unquote, and leap into absurdity. Schopenhauer, also of the generation after Kant and a contemporary of Hegel, disagreed violently with the cowardly attempts to return to religion after the rejection of Enlightenment reason. While Hegel populated Kant's noumenal realm with dialectical spirit, and Schleiermacher and Kierkegaard felt or hoped desperately that God was out there, Schopenhauer's feelings had revealed to him that reality is will, a deeply irrational and conflictual will, striving always and blindly toward nothing. No wonder, then, that reason had no chance of comprehending it. Reason's rigid categories and neat organizational schemes are wholly inadequate for a reality that is the opposite of that. Only like can know like. Only via our own wills, our passionate feelings, especially those evoked in us by music, can we grasp the essence of reality. But most of us are too cowardly to try, for reality is cruel and frightening. This is why we cling to reason so desperately. Reason allows us to tidy things up, to make ourselves feel safe and secure, to escape from the swirling horror that, in our honest moments, we sense reality to be. Only the bravest few have the courage to pierce through the illusions of reason to the irrationality of reality. Only a few individuals of special sensitivity are willing to pierce reason's veil and intuit passionately the seething flow. Of course, having intuited the cruel horror of the seething flow, Schopenhauer wished for self-annihilation. This was the weakness that his disciple Nietzsche urged us to overcome. Nietzsche began epistemologically by agreeing with Kant. Quote, when Kant says, reason does not derive its laws from nature, but prescribes them to nature, this is, in regard to the concept of nature, completely true, unquote. All of the problems of philosophy, from the decadent Socrates to that, quote, catastrophic spider, unquote, Kant, are caused by their emphasis on reason. The rise of the philosophers meant the fall of man, for once reason took over, men, quote, no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect, these unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ, unquote. And, quote, how pitiful, how shadowy and fleeting, how aimless and capricious the human intellect is, unquote. Being merely a surface phenomenon, and dependent upon underlying instinctual drives, the intellect certainly is not autonomous or in control of anything. What Nietzsche meant then, with his passionate exhortations to be true to oneself, is to break out of the artificial and constricting categories of reason. Reason is a tool of weaklings who are afraid to be naked in the face of a cruel and conflictual reality, and who therefore build fantasy intellectual structures to hide in. What we need to bring out the best possible in us is, quote, the perfect functioning of the regulating unconscious instincts, unquote. The yaysayer, the man of the future, will not be tempted to play word games, but will embrace conflict. He will tap into his deepest drives, his will to power, and channel all of his instinctual energies in a vital new direction. Summary of irrationalist themes. In contrast to Schleiermacher, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, then, Kant and Hegel seem like champions of reason. Yet Kantian and Hegelian assumptions launched the irrationalist movements of the 19th century. The legacy of the irrationalists for the 20th century included 4 key themes. 1. An agreement with Kant that reason is impotent to know reality. 2. An agreement with Hegel that reality is deeply conflictual and/or absurd. 3. A conclusion that reason is therefore trumped by claims based on feeling, instinct, or leaps of faith. And 4. That the non-rational and the irrational yield deep truths about reality. The death of Nietzsche in 1900 brings us to the 20th century. 19th century German philosophy had developed 2 main lines of thought, the speculative metaphysical and the irrationalist epistemological. What was needed was a way to bring those 2 strands of thought together in a new synthesis for the new century. The philosopher who accomplished this was Martin Heidegger. End of Chapter 2. Explaining Postmodernism. Chapter 3. The 20th Century Collapse of Reason. Heidegger's synthesis of the Continental tradition. Martin Heidegger took Hegelian philosophy and gave it a personal, phenomenological twist. Heidegger is notorious for the obscurity of his prose and for his actions and inactions on behalf of the National Socialists during the 1930s. And he is unquestionably the leading 20th century philosopher for the postmodernists. Derrida and Foucault identify themselves as followers of Heidegger. Rorty cites Heidegger as one of the 3 major influences on his thinking, the other 2 being Dewey and Wittgenstein. Heidegger absorbed and modified the tradition of German philosophy. Like Kant, Heidegger believed reason to be a superficial phenomenon, and he adopted the Kantian view of words and concepts as obstacles to our coming to know reality, or being. However, like Hegel, Heidegger believed that we can get closer to being than Kant allowed, though not by adopting Hegel's abstracted third-person pretense of reason with a capital R. Setting aside both reason and reason with a capital R, Heidegger agreed with Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer that by exploring his feelings, especially his dark and anguished feelings of dread and guilt, he could approach being. And like all good German philosophers, Heidegger agreed that when we get to the core of being, we will find conflict and contradiction at the heart of things. So what is new? Heidegger's distinctiveness was his use of phenomenology to get us there. Phenomenology becomes philosophically important once we accept the Kantian conclusion that we cannot start as realists and scientists do by assuming that we are aware of an external independent reality that is made up of objects that we are trying to understand. But, from the phenomenological standpoint, we must also realize that Kant took only a timid half-step. While Kant was willing to give up the noumenal object, he held on to the belief in an underlying noumenal self with a specific nature available to us for our investigation. But a noumenal self underlying the flow of phenomena is just as problematic a notion as the notion of noumenal objects underlying the flow. Recognizing this, Heidegger therefore wanted to start, following Nietzsche's occasional but undeveloped suggestions, without making the assumption of the existence of either an object or a subject. So we start phenomenologically, that is, by simply and clearly describing the phenomena of experience and change. On Heidegger's account, what one finds when starting so is a sense of projection into a field of experience and change. Do not think objects, Heidegger counseled. Think fields. Do not think subject. Think experience. We start small and local, with Daseins being projected into reality. Dasein is Heidegger's substitute concept for self, subject, or human being, all of which he thought carried undesirable baggage from earlier philosophy. Heidegger explained his choice of Dasein by defining it as follows, quote, Dasein means being projected into nothing, unquote. Ignoring the nothing for now, it is the being projected that is Dasein, not that if anything, which is projected or does the projecting. The emphasis is on activity, thus avoiding assumptions that there are two things, a subject and an object, that enter into a relationship. There is simply action, the action of being out there, being thrust into. The being projected reveals and clothes successively over time various semi-stable fields or beings, what we would call objects if we had not already shed our naive realism. Yet the long process of describing the phenomena of being, Heidegger found, led him inexorably to a question, the question that has haunted all of philosophy. What is the being of the various beings? The beings differ and change, come and go, yet for all their changeability and difference, they still manifest a oneness, a commonality. They all are. What is that being underlying or behind or common to all beings? What makes the beings be? Or, raising the stakes to the Heideggerian question of all questions, why is there even being at all? Why is there not rather nothing? This is no ordinary question. With a question like this, Heidegger pointed out, reason quickly finds itself in trouble. The same kind of trouble that Kant had pointed out with his antinomies. Reason always reaches contradictions whenever it attempts to explore deep metaphysical issues. A question such as, why is there being and not rather nothing, is therefore repugnant to reason. For Heidegger, this meant that if we are to explore the question, then reason, the, quote, most stiff-necked adversary of thought, unquote, was an obstacle that had to be discarded. Setting aside reason and logic. The question is repugnant to reason, as Heidegger wrote in An Introduction to Metaphysics, because we reach logical absurdity whichever way we go in attempting to answer it. If we say, on the one hand, that there is no answer to the question of why there is being, if being just is for no reason, then that makes being absurd. Something that cannot be explained is an absurdity to reason. But if, on the other hand, we say that being is for a reason, then what could that reason be? We would have to say that that reason, whatever it is outside of being. But outside of being is nothing, which means that we would have to try to explain being from nothingness, which is also absurd. So either way we go in trying to answer the question, we are deeply into absurdity. Logic, at this point, wants to forbid the question. Logic wants to say that the absurdity shows that the question is ill-formed and so should be set aside. Logic wants instead to make the existence of reality its axiom and to proceed from there with discovering the identities of the various existents. On the other hand, switching back to a Heideggerian perspective, the questions spawned by the question strike very deep feelings in Dasein. What about the nothingness that being would have come from? Could being not have been? Could being return once again to the nothing? Such questions are compellingly awesome, and yet at the same time they fill Dasein with a sense of dis-ease and anxiety. So here Dasein has a conflict. Logic and reason say that the question is contradictory and so should be set aside. But Dasein's feelings urge Dasein to explore the question in a non-verbal, emotional way. So which does Dasein choose? Contradiction and feeling, or logic and reason? Fortunately, as we have learned from Hegel, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, this contradiction and conflict is yet another sign that logic and reason are impotent. As we should all know by now, we should expect to find conflict and contradiction at the heart of things. Contradiction is the sign that we are on to something important. So, mere logic, Heidegger concluded, quote, an invention of school teachers, not of philosophers, unquote, cannot and should not get in the way of probing the ultimate mystery that is being. We must reject entirely the assumption, quote, that in this inquiry, logic is the highest court of appeal. that reason is the means and thinking the way to an original comprehension of nothing and its possible revelation, unquote. Again, quote, if this contradiction breaks the sovereignty of reason in the field of inquiry into nothing and being, then the fate of the rule of logic is also decided. The very idea of logic disintegrates in the vortex of more original questioning, unquote. And again, in case we have missed the point, quote, authentic speaking about nothing always remains extraordinary. It cannot be vulgarized. It dissolves if it is placed in the cheap acid of merely logical intelligence, unquote. Deep feeling about nothing trumps logic any day. Emotions as revelatory. Having subjected reason and logic to destruction, and then set them aside as merely one superficial way of thinking, one that the Greeks had established faithfully for all subsequent Western thought, we need another route to being and nothing. We can try to explore language without the presuppositions of reason and logic, but even the elements of language, words, have evolved over time and become so twisted and crusted over with layers of meaning that they almost entirely hide being from us. Their original force and contact with reality has been lost. We can, therefore, try to strip away from our language the encrusted layers to reveal the words that had original and genuine connective force to being, but that will require special efforts. For Heidegger, the special effort that is required is emotional, an exploratory letting oneself go into the revelatory emotions of boredom, fear, guilt, and dread. Boredom is a good mood to start with. When we are bored, really bored, we are no longer engaged with the ordinary, trivial, day-to-day things that occupy most of our time. When we are bored, quote, drifting hither and thither in the abysses of existence like a mute fog, unquote, all beings become a matter of indifference, undifferentiated from one another. Everything merges or dissolves into an undistinguished unity. Progress has thus been made. Quote, this boredom reveals what is in totality, unquote. Real boredom takes one away from one's normal focus on particular beings and one's cares for them, and diffuses one's awareness into a sense of being as a whole's being revealed to one. But this revelation also brings with it anxiety and dread, for part of the process of the dissolution of particular beings into a state of undifferentiation is the dissolution of one's own sense of being a unique, individual being. One has the feeling of beings being dissolved into an undifferentiated being, but at the same time, one has the feeling of one's self-identity as also slipping into a state of being nothing in particular, that is, of becoming nothing. This is distressing. Quote, in dread, we are in suspense, wir schweben. Or, to put it more precisely, dread holds us in suspense because it makes what is in totality slip away from us. Hence, we too, as existence in the midst of what is, slip away from ourselves along with it. For this reason, it is not you or I that has the uncanny feeling, but one. Unquote. This sense of dread that comes with the sense of dissolution of all beings along with oneself was for Heidegger a metaphysically potent state, for in effect one gets a foretaste of one's own death, a sense of one's being annihilated, a sense of going into nothingness, and thus a sense of getting to the metaphysical center of being. One must absolutely not, therefore, give into one's overpowering sense of distress and run away from dread and back to the safety of one's petty day-to-day life. One must embrace one's dread and surrender to it, for, quote, the dread felt by the courageous, unquote, is the emotional state that prepares one for the ultimate revelation. That ultimate revelation is of the truth of Judeo-Christian and Hegelian metaphysics. In dread, we come to feel that being and nothing are identical. This is what all philosophy based on the Greek model had missed, and what all philosophies not based on the Greek model had been struggling toward. Quote, "Nothing," wrote Heidegger, "not merely provides the conceptual opposite of what is, but is also an original part of essence." Unquote. Heidegger credited Hegel with having reclaimed this lost insight for the Western tradition. Quote, "Pure being and pure nothing are thus one and the same. This proposition of Hegel's is correct." Unquote. Hegel, of course, got it from trying to resuscitate the Judeo-Christian account of creation, in which God created the world out of nothing. As Heidegger put it, in reaffirming that Judeo-Christian claim, quote, "Every being, insofar as it is a being, is made out of nothing." Unquote. So, after abandoning reasoning and logic, after experiencing real boredom and terrifying dread, we unveil the final mystery of mysteries. Nothing. In the end, all is nothing, and nothing is all. With Heidegger, we reach metaphysical nihilism. Heidegger and postmodernism. Heidegger's philosophy is the integration of the two main lines of German philosophy, the speculative metaphysical and the irrationalist epistemological. After Kant, the Continental tradition quickly and gleefully abandoned reason, putting wild speculation, clashing wills, and troubled emotion at the forefront. In Heidegger's synthesis of the Continental tradition, we can see clearly many of the ingredients of postmodernism. Heidegger offered to his followers the following conclusions, all of which are accepted by the mainstream of postmodernism with slight modifications. 1. Conflict and contradiction are the deepest truths of reality. 2. Reason is subjective and impotent to reach truths about reality. 3. Reason's elements, words, and concepts are obstacles that must be uncrusted, subjected to destruction, or otherwise unmasked. 4. Logical contradiction is neither a sign of failure nor of anything particularly significant at all. 5. Feelings, especially morbid feelings of anxiety and dread, are a deeper guide than reason. 6. The entire Western tradition of philosophy, whether Platonic, Aristotelian, Lockean, or Cartesian, based as it is on the law of non-contradiction and the subject-object distinction, is the enemy to be overcome. This is not yet to introduce Heidegger's strong social and political collectivism, which is also part of his inheritance from the main lines of German philosophy. Nor is it to make explicit, as Heidegger did, his strong anti-science and anti-technology views. Nor is it yet to discuss his anti-humanism, with his regular calls for us to be obedient to being, to feel guilty before being, to pay homage to being, and even, quote, to sacrifice man for the truth of being, unquote, which, if we are still allowed to be logical, means sacrificing ourselves to nothing. Those elements in Heidegger's philosophy will arise in Chapter 4 in the context of discussing the political background to postmodernism. What the postmodernists will do in the next generation is abandon the remnants of metaphysics in Heidegger's philosophy, along with his occasional streaks of mysticism. Heidegger was still doing metaphysics, and he spoke of there being a truth out there about the world that we must seek or let find us. The postmodernists, by contrast, are anti-realists, holding that it is meaningless to speak of truths out there or of a language that could capture them. As anti-realists, accordingly, they will reject the formulation of one above as a metaphysical assertion, and instead reformulate its assertion of the reign of conflict and contradiction as merely descriptive of the flow of empirical phenomena. And, while they will accept 3 above, they will accept it while abandoning Heidegger's faint hope that ultimate concepts connecting us to reality may be revealed at the end of the unmasking. The postmodernists will effect a compromise between Heidegger and Nietzsche. Common to Heidegger and Nietzsche epistemologically is a contemptuous rejection of reason. Metaphysically, though, the postmodernists will drop the remnants of Heidegger's metaphysical quest for being and put Nietzsche's power struggles at the core of our being. And, especially in the cases of Foucault and Derrida, most major postmodernists will abandon Nietzsche's sense of the exalted potential of man and embrace Heidegger's anti-humanism. Positivism and Analytic Philosophy, from Europe to America. So far, my account of the epistemological origins of postmodernism has concentrated on German developments in philosophy. Those developments are most of the story of the background to postmodernism. In Europe, if one was a philosophically trained intellectual in the middle part of the 20th century, one's training was primarily in Kant, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. Those thinkers set the philosophical framework of discussion for European intellectuals, and that framework goes a long way toward accounting for the rise of postmodernism. Yet my account of postmodernism as developed so far is incomplete. Postmodernism's strongholds are in the American academy, not the European. Rorty is, of course, American, and while Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard are French, they have many more adherents in America than they do in France or even Europe. So there is a gap that must be bridged. How did the Counter-Enlightenment tradition come to prominence in the English-speaking world, especially North America? The gap is wider intellectually than it is geographically. For the longest time, the American Academy had little use for Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. The Anglo-American tradition saw itself as the champion of the Enlightenment project. It allied itself with science, with rigor, with reason, and with objectivity, and it rejected contemptuously Hegel's speculative wanderings and Kierkegaard's wallowings. It had been deeply impressed with science, and it saw science as the alternative to now discredited religious and speculative philosophy. It wanted to make philosophy scientific and to justify the roots of science. This positivist spirit, pro-science and pro-logic, dominated the Anglo-American intellectual world for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. The collapse of the positivistic spirit in Anglo-American philosophy is therefore part of the story of the rise of postmodernism. As strong as Enlightenment traditions were and are in America and Britain, those cultures were never Enlightenment islands unto themselves. European and especially German philosophical influences began to be a presence shortly after the Revolution in France. The English Romantics, most famously, were among the first to turn to Germany for philosophical and literary inspiration. Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, for example, spent time in Germany for that purpose. Wordsworth's famous lines signal the new anti-reason trend. Quote, "Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect." Unquote. John Keats's lines continue it. Quote, "Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy?" Unquote. And Thomas de Quincey is perhaps the clearest prose representative of what many of the English Romantics absorbed from German philosophy. Quote, "Here I pause for one moment to exhort the reader never to pay any attention to his understanding when it stands in opposition to any other faculty of his mind. The mere understanding, however useful and indispensable, is the meanest faculty of the human mind, and the most to be distrusted. And yet the great majority of people trust to nothing else, which may do for ordinary life, but not for philosophical purposes." Unquote. Germany's rising star was also signaled by the popularity of Germain de Stael's Germany, published in 1813, a book that had a major impact on French, English, and American intellectual life. In the United States, Madame de Stael's book inspired many budding intellectuals to take up the study of German language and literature. It was read by the young Ralph Waldo Emerson, later to become America's leading man of letters. In conjunction with her book's popularity, the 1810s and 1820s also began a trend of young intellectuals going to Germany for study. This group included many of those later prominent in American intellectual life. Edward Everett was one of Emerson's professors at Harvard. Ralph's brother William studied the new Schleiermacher and Hegel-inspired approaches to theology and biblical criticism at Heidelberg. George Tickner later became professor of belles lettres at Harvard, and George Bancroft, quote, the father of American history, unquote, attended several German universities, including hearing Hegel's lectures in Berlin. Quote, until 1830, historian Thomas Niberty points out, it was the general rule that talented and curious young minds gravitated to Paris. But from then on they came in ever-increasing numbers, American students, for example, to Germany, to Berlin, unquote. They brought back with them Kantian and Hegelian philosophy. By the middle of the 19th century, German ideas were established in America. One indication of this is that the most important philosophical journal in America from 1867 to 1893, the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, was founded in 1867 by a group of Hegelians in the St. Louis Philosophical Society. This list of German philosophical influence is not yet especially weighty, for America in the 19th century was not yet an intellectual or cultural powerhouse, and the intellectual and cultural life that did flourish was still largely guided by Enlightenment philosophy. To the extent that intellectual life flourished in America, German philosophy existed as a minority tradition alongside the dominantly pro-reason and pro-science traditions coming out of the Enlightenment. From positivism to analysis. Yet early in the 20th century, the influence of German philosophy began to increase significantly. Setting aside until chapters 4 and 5 better-known German imports such as Marxism, and setting aside the massive exodus of intellectuals from Germany to England and America in the 1930s because of the rise of National Socialism, the impact of German philosophy upon Anglo-American intellectual life was being felt even by the beginning of the century. Our focus in this chapter is upon epistemology, and epistemological concerns dominated Anglo-American philosophy for the first half of the 20th century. The various leading schools of 20th century Anglo-American philosophy, broadly positivist in their orientation, and collectively known as analytic philosophy, are deeply indebted to German philosophy. As philosopher Michael Dummett has written, quote, the sources of analytic philosophy were in the writings of philosophers who wrote principally or exclusively in the German language, unquote. Analytic philosophy is not, however, a variant on Hegelian speculative or Husserlian phenomenological philosophy, although Bertrand Russell was a Hegelian and a partial Kantian early in his career, and Gilbert Ryle was an early exponent of Husserl's approach. Analytic philosophy developed out of 19th century positivism. Positivism was developed in the 19th century by scientists with a strong philosophical bent and by philosophers strongly impressed with science. The philosophical framework that they operated within drew heavily upon Hume's nominalist and skeptical empiricism and upon Kant's epistemology. Positivism accepted as firm philosophical principles the Humean dichotomy of facts and values, the Humean and Kantian analytic-synthetic dichotomy, and, as a premise, the Kantian conclusion that while seeking metaphysical truths about the universe may be fruitless and meaningless, science could at least make progress with organizing and explaining the flow of phenomena. In the second half of the century, positivism was given further impetus and a new direction by innovations in logic and the foundations of mathematics, developed primarily by the German mathematicians Gottlob Frege, Richard Dedekind, David Hilbert, and Georg Cantor. To the extent that these mathematicians were philosophical, they offered Platonic and Kantian interpretations of mathematics. The new impetus was felt strongly in the English-speaking world early in the 20th century when, just prior to World War I, Bertrand Russell brought the German developments to the English-speaking world, publishing with A. N. Whitehead, Principia Mathematica, 1910 through 1913. Russell's work on logic and the philosophy of logic was in turn one of the streams that fed into the creation of the logical positivist school. Logical positivism's origins are also culturally German, in the regular meetings of the Vienna Circle, begun after the Great War by a talented group of philosophically informed scientists and science-impressed philosophers. Logical positivism developed into a philosophical force and was then re-imported into the English-speaking world, most famously by A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic in 1936. While initially motivated to uphold reason, logic, and science, Positivism's and analysis's internal developments led to their core commitments becoming hollowed out and their consequent collapse. Recasting philosophy's function. At the beginning of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell best foreshadowed what was to come. In the final chapter of an often read introductory book, The Problems of Philosophy, 1912, Russell summarized the history of philosophy as a repeating series of failures to answer its questions. Can we prove that there is an external world? No. Can we prove that there is cause and effect? No. Can we validate the objectivity of our inductive generalizations? No. Can we find an objective basis for morality? Definitely not. Russell concluded that philosophy cannot answer its questions, and so came to believe that any value philosophy might have cannot lie in being able to offer truth or wisdom. Ludwig Wittgenstein and the early logical positivists agreed with Russell, taking his conclusions one step further by offering an explanation for philosophy's failure. Philosophy cannot answer its questions because its questions are simply meaningless. It is not the case, they argued, that philosophy asks questions that, unfortunately, are just too difficult for us to answer. Philosophy's questions themselves are not even intelligible. They are pseudo-formulations. Foreshadowing postmodernism's anti-realism, for example, Moritz Schlick wrote of the meaninglessness of propositions about an external world. Quote, "Does the external world exist is an unintelligible question, for, quote, both its denial and affirmation are meaningless," unquote. And if we cannot speak meaningfully of an external world, then ascribing cause and effect to the world is also meaningless. Causality is, quote, a superstition, unquote, wrote Wittgenstein. The mistake earlier philosophers had made was in thinking that philosophy was about its own unique subject matter. But that is wrong, the logical positivists asserted. Philosophy has no content, such as metaphysics, ethics, theology, or aesthetics. Those are all meaningless inquiries and should be dismissed. The meaninglessness of philosophy's traditional questions means that we must recast philosophy's function. Philosophy is not a content discipline, but a method discipline. The function of philosophy is analysis, elucidation, clarification. Philosophy is not a subject. Its only role is to be an analytical assistant to science. Hence, analytic philosophy. The new purpose of philosophy is only to analyze the perceptual, linguistic, and logical tools that science uses. Scientists perceive, organize their observations linguistically in concepts and propositions, and then they structure those linguistic units using logic. Philosophy's job, accordingly, is to figure out what perception, language, and logic are all about. The question then is, what conclusions has 20th century analytical philosophy reached about perception, language, and logic? Perception, concepts, and logic. By the middle of the century, the dominant conclusion about perception was that it is theory-laden. The biggest names in the philosophy of science, Otto Neurath, Karl Popper, Norwood Hansen, Paul Feyerabend, Thomas Kuhn, and W.V.O. Quine, despite wide variations in their versions of analytic philosophy, all argued that our theories largely dictate what we will see. Putting their point in Kant's original language, our perceptual intuitions do not conform to objects, but rather our intuition conforms to what our faculty of knowledge supplies from itself. This conclusion about perception is devastating for science. If our percepts are theory-laden, then perception is hardly a neutral and independent check upon our theorizing. If our conceptual structures shape our observations as much as vice versa, then we are stuck inside a subjective system with no direct access to reality. Similarly, by the middle of the century, the mainstream conclusion about concepts and the propositions of logic and mathematics was that they are conventional. Most of the logical positivists started by agreeing with Hume and Kant that logical and mathematical propositions are analytic or a priori and necessary. On this account, twice 2 makes 4, for example, has to be true, and we can determine its truth without appeal to experience, simply by analyzing the meanings of its constituent concepts. Such a proposition contrasts with one such as, Beverly's car is white. That Beverly's car is white is synthetic. Neither car nor white is contained in the other concept's meaning. So the connection between the two has to be established by experience, and the established connection between them is merely contingent. The car could have been painted any other color. This standard Humean Kantian dichotomy of analytic and synthetic propositions immediately yields a very problematic implication. Logical and mathematical propositions are disconnected from experiential reality. Propositions about the world of experience, such as Beverly's car is white, are never necessarily true, and propositions of logic and mathematics, such as twice 2 makes 4, being necessarily true, must not be about the world of experience. Logical and mathematical propositions, wrote Schlick, quote, do not deal with any facts, but only with the symbols by means of which the facts are expressed, unquote. Logic and mathematics, accordingly, tell us absolutely nothing about the experiential world of facts. As Wittgenstein put it succinctly in the Tractatus, quote, all propositions of logic say the same thing, that is, nothing, unquote. Logic and mathematics, then, are on their way to becoming mere games of symbolic manipulation. Such conclusions about logic and mathematics are devastating for science. If logic and mathematics are divorced from experiential reality, then the rules of logic and mathematics hardly say anything about that reality. The implication is that logical or mathematical proof cuts no ice in adjudicating competing claims of fact. Analytic propositions are, quote, entirely devoid of factual content, and it is for this reason that no experience can confute them, unquote. Offering logical proofs about real matters of fact is thus pointless, and, conversely, it is pointless to expect that any amount of factual evidence to add up to a necessary or universal conclusion. Accepting that the propositions of logic and mathematics are not based in experiential reality and so do not tell us anything about that reality leads one to the question of where logic and mathematics come from. If they have no objective source, then their source must be subjective. Two broad options emerged at this point within analytic philosophy. The neo-Kantian option, emphasized by the nativists and the coherence theorists, held that the basic propositions of logic and mathematics are innate in us, or necessarily emerge psychologically once we start to use words. And some such neo-Kantians scandalized the purer Kantians by holding out the hope that such innate or emergent propositions reflect or represent in some way an external reality. But, critics always asked, given the theory-ladenness of perception, how would we establish that such a connection exists? Any belief in a connection between reality and subjectively generated logic could only be reached by a leap of faith. It was the neo-Humean option, therefore, emphasized by pragmatists such as Quine, Nelson Goodman, and Ernest Nagel, that prevailed. On this account, logical and mathematical propositions are merely a function of how we have decided to use words, and which combinations of words we have decided to privilege. Concepts are merely nominal, based on subjective human choices about how to carve up the flow of phenomenal experience. Conceptual relativism follows directly from such nominalism. We could have decided differently what concepts to adopt. We could have and still could carve the world up differently. We could, for example, decide not to pick out one section of the color spectrum and call it blue, and call the neighboring section green, but rather pick an overlap area between them and, borrowing words from Goodman for a slightly different purpose, call it either grew or bleen. That's a matter of convention. If all concepts are nominal, then one consequence is that there is no basis for a distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. All propositions then become a posteriori and merely contingent. Logical relativism is the next consequence. Logical principles are constructs of concepts. What counts as a principle of logic, then, is not dictated by reality, but is rather up to us. Quote, the principles of logic and mathematics are true universally simply because we never allow them to be anything else. Unquote. Logical principles become a matter of which formulations we are, quote, willing, unquote, to accept, depending on whether or not we like the consequences of accepting any given principle. Logical justification, Rorty wrote of Quine's doctrine, quote, is not a matter of a special relation between ideas or words and objects, but of conversation, of social practice, unquote. But what if someone does not like the consequences of adopting a given logical principle? What if conversational or social practices change? If the rules of language and logic are conventional, what is to stop someone, from whatever reason, from adopting different conventions? Absolutely nothing. The rules of logic and grammar then can be as variable as other conventions, such as performing greeting rituals by shaking hands, hugging, or rubbing noses. No form of greeting or system of logic, then, is more objectively right than any other. By the 1950s, these conclusions were commonplace. Language and logic were seen as conventional, internal systems, and not as objective, reality-based tools of consciousness. From the collapse of logical positivism to Kuhn and Rorty. The next step was Thomas Kuhn's. The publication in 1962 of his landmark book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, announced the developments of the preceding 4 decades of analytic philosophy and highlighted the dead end it had reached. If science's tools are perception, logic, and language, then science, one of the Enlightenment's prized children, is merely an evolving, socially subjective enterprise with no more claim to objectivity than any other belief system. The idea that science speaks of reality or truth is an illusion. There is no truth. There are only truths, and truths change. Consequently, by the 1960s, the pro-objectivity, pro-science spirit had collapsed in the Anglo-American tradition. Richard Rorty, the best known of the American postmodernists, generalizes the point to anti-realism. As Kant had said 2 centuries ago, we can say absolutely nothing about the noumena, about what is really real. Rorty's anti-realism is the exact same point. Quote, "To say that we should drop the idea of truth as out there waiting to be discovered is not to say that we have discovered that out there is no truth. It is to say that our purposes would be served best by ceasing to see truth as a deep matter, as a topic of philosophical interest, or true as a term which repays analysis. The nature of truth is an unprofitable topic, resembling in this respect the nature of man and the nature of God." Unquote. Summary: a vacuum for postmodernism to fill. Speaking of the post-Kuhn era in Anglo-American philosophy, historian of philosophy John Passmore has stated flatly and accurately, quote, "The Kantian revival is so widespread as scarcely to lend itself to illustration." Unquote. The various analytic schools began with Kant's conclusion that metaphysical questions were unanswerable, contradictory, or meaningless nonsense to be set aside. Philosophers were then urged to retreat to conceiving of their discipline as a purely critical or analytical enterprise. As part of that enterprise, some early analytic philosophers sought universal and necessary structural features in grammar and logic. But with no external metaphysical basis for language and logic, they retreated further to the subjective and the psychological. Once there, they found that the subjective and the psychological were highly conventional and variable, and so they felt forced to conclude that language and logic not only have nothing to do with reality, but are themselves conventional and variable. Then arose the question of the status of science. Analytic philosophers had, for whatever reasons, decided that they liked science, and so had picked its concepts and methods to analyze. But now they had to ask, as Paul Feyerabend urged them to ask, why is science special? Why not analyze theology's concepts and methods, or poetry's, or witchcraft's? Having abandoned discussion of truth as a useless metaphysical speculation, analytic philosophers could not say that science's concepts were truer, or that science's method was special because it gets us closer to truth. The analytic philosophers of the 1950s and 1960s were only able to say that science happened to push their personal value buttons. So now we ask the question of value. If the basis for the study of science is one's personal value buttons being pushed, what is the status of personal values? On questions of value, by the middle of the century, the Anglo-American tradition had concurred with the Continental, Again, the conclusions reached by the analytic tradition were highly subjectivist and relativist. Accepting the divorce of facts from values that dated back to Hume, most philosophers concluded that expressions of value are neither objective nor subject to reason. Summarizing the state of the profession in the middle part of the century, Brian Medlin wrote that, quote, "It is now pretty generally accepted by professional philosophers that ultimate ethical principles must be arbitrary," unquote. Their arbitrariness could be rooted in sheer acts of will, or in social conventions, or, as argued by the leading logical positivists, subjective emotional expression. Having reached these conclusions about knowledge, science, and values, the Anglo-American intellectual world was ready to take seriously Nietzsche and Heidegger. First thesis: Postmodernism is the end result of Kantian epistemology. After this whirlwind tour of 220 years of philosophy, I can now summarize and offer my first hypothesis about the origins of postmodernism. Postmodernism is the first ruthlessly consistent statement of the consequences of rejecting reason, those consequences being necessary given the history of epistemology since Kant. The key ingredients of postmodernism were laid out by the philosophers of the first half of the 20th century. The developments in Continental philosophy up to Heidegger provided the positive direction and impetus that postmodernism takes. And the negative developments in Anglo-American philosophy up to the collapse of logical positivism left the defenders of reason and science feeling dispirited, directionless, and unable to mount any significant response to the skeptical and relativistic arguments the postmodernists used. Yet much of 20th century philosophy had been piecemeal and unsystematic, especially in the Anglo-American tradition. Postmodernism is the first synthesis of the implications of the major trends. In postmodernism we find metaphysical anti-realism, epistemological subjectivity, the placing of feeling at the root of all value issues, and the consequent relativism of both knowledge and values, and the consequent devaluing or disvaluing of the scientific enterprise. Metaphysics and epistemology are at the heart of this account of postmodernism. Despite the postmodernists' billing of themselves as anti-metaphysics and anti-epistemology, their writings focus upon those themes almost exclusively. Heidegger attacks logic and reason to make room for emotion. Foucault reduces knowledge to an expression of social power. Derrida deconstructs language and turns it into a vehicle of aesthetic play, and Rorty chronicles the failures of the realist and objectivist tradition in almost exclusively metaphysical and epistemological terms. From the postmodern anti-realist metaphysics and anti-reason epistemology, the postmodern social consequences follow almost directly. Once we set aside reality and reason, what are we left with to go on? We can, as the conservatives would prefer, simply turn to our group's traditions and follow them. Or we can, as the postmodernists will prefer, turn to our feelings and follow them. If we then ask what our core feelings are, we connect with the answers from the past century's dominant theories of human nature. From Kierkegaard and Heidegger, we learn that our emotional core is a deep sense of dread and guilt. From Marx, we feel a deep sense of alienation, victimization, and rage. From Nietzsche, we discover a deep need for power. From Freud, we uncover the urgings of dark and aggressive sexuality. Rage, power, guilt, lust, and dread constitute the center of the postmodern emotional universe. Postmodernists split over whether those core feelings are determined biologically or socially, with the social version running as the strong favorite. In either case, however, individuals are not in control of their feelings. Their identities are a product of their group memberships, whether economic, sexual, or racial. Since the shaping economic, sexual, or racial experiences or developments vary from group to group, differing groups have no common experiential framework. With no objective standard by which to mediate their different perspectives and feelings, and with no appeal to reason possible, group balkanization and conflict must necessarily result. Nasty political correctness as a tactic then makes perfect sense. Having rejected reason, we will not expect ourselves or others to behave reasonably. Having put our passions to the fore, we will act and react more crudely and range of the moment. Having lost our sense of ourselves as individuals, we will seek our identities in our groups. Having little in common with different groups, we will see them as competitive enemies. Having abandoned recourse to rational and neutral standards, violent competition will seem practical. And having abandoned peaceful conflict resolution, prudence will dictate that only the most ruthless will survive. Postmodernist reactions to the prospects of a brutal postmodern social world then fall into three main categories, depending on whether Foucault's, Derrida's, or Rorty's variant is given primacy. Foucault, following Nietzsche more closely in having reduced knowledge to an expression of social power, urges us to play the brutal power politics game. Though contrary to Nietzsche, he urges that we play it on behalf of the traditionally disempowered. Derrida, having followed Heidegger more closely and purified him, deconstructs language and retreats into it as a vehicle of aesthetic play, insulating himself from the fray. Rorty, having abandoned objectivity, hopes that we will seek, quote, intersubjective agreement, unquote, among the, quote, members of our own tribe, unquote, and feeling loyal to his American left liberal roots, requests that we be nice to each other while doing so. The postmodern options, in short, are to plunge into the fray, or withdraw and insulate oneself from it, or try to ameliorate its excesses. Postmodernism is thus the end result of the Counter-Enlightenment inaugurated by Kantian epistemology. End of chapter 3.